Hey there, welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into Queens, New York, the stomping grounds of a man who became legend, Kenneth McGriff. Some knew him simply as Supreme. To the streets, he was the kingpin who built an empire. To hip-hop, he was the shadow behind the music, the bridge between the block and the booth. And to law enforcement, he was the face of everything they feared about drugs, gangs, and power in the 80s and 90s. But Supreme's story isn't just about crime. It's about how one man went from hustling on the corners of South Jamaica to shaping the culture that would change music forever. And in the end, how it all came crashing down. Before we get started, let me ask you something. Where are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it where you are? I love seeing how this little underworld of ours connects across time zones, from one city to the next. Oh, and if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell too. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. All right, take a breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. And follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons. Your sleepy dawn. The gunfire came years later. The money, the cars, the whispered name that carried weight on every corner of Queens. That all came later too. But before Kenneth McGriff was known as Supreme, before the empire and the downfall, there was just a boy staring out a cracked window at a world already burning. South Jamaica, New York, in the late 1960s was a place where opportunity felt like a rumor, and survival was the only law that mattered. Imagine the streets then, rows of brick apartment buildings stained with graffiti, kids running barefoot through hydrant spray in the summer heat, and the constant hum of frustration in the air. The factories were closing, jobs were disappearing, and heroin was carving its way through families one needle at a time. The neighborhood had two faces. By day, it looked ordinary enough. Women dragging grocery bags home, fathers heading to shifts they hated, kids hustling stickball games in the streets. But by night, a different face emerged. You could feel it in the way the street lights flickered, in the way doors bolted early. Shadows lingered, deals whispered on corners, and children, bright, restless children like Kenneth, soaked it all in without even realizing it. He was born in 1960, in the heart of Queens, into a family that carried hope but lived on thin margins. His parents weren't gangsters, weren't hustlers. They were ordinary people trying to carve out a small, decent life in a neighborhood that made that nearly impossible. Rent was always a stretch, paychecks were always too short, and temptation always seemed just a step away. Kenneth's world was not defined by luxury or stability, but by struggle. As a child, Kenneth saw the small victories his parents fought for, keeping the lights on, getting him to school, trying to shield him from the chaos outside. But no parent, no matter how determined, could completely block out the influence of the streets. On the walk to school, he'd pass corners where teenagers with sharp eyes and quick tongues leaned against lampposts, already pocketing more money in a day than his parents would see in a week. They wore gold chains that glittered in the sun, clothes cleaner than anything Kenneth had ever owned. To a young boy, it looked like freedom. To his parents, it looked like danger. And both were right. By the early 70s, Queens was changing fast. The heroin epidemic had left behind an entire generation of broken bodies and empty homes. Abandoned buildings became havens for dealers and addicts. Gangs, once small-time neighborhood crews, grew sharper, meaner, more organized. Kenneth was growing too, tall, observant, quiet in a way that made people underestimate him. He watched everything. Watched how older boys carried themselves, how respect was given to those who commanded fear. Watched how money moved like a river through the hands of hustlers, never sticking around, but always coming back. There's something about growing up in a place where the rules are clear but brutal. You learn early that authority doesn't belong to teachers or cops or even parents. It belongs to whoever can hold the corner. Kenneth didn't just learn this. He absorbed it like oxygen. The streets became his classroom, and every fight, every deal, every whispered rumor became his lesson. Still, in those early years, there was nothing inevitable about Kenneth's path. He was not yet supreme. He was just another kid with a choice, or at least the illusion of one. He could have gone the other way. School, work, a quiet life. Some of his friends tried. Some of them made it. But for everyone that did, 5 more were swallowed by the block. And Kenneth could feel the pull, stronger with every year. There's a memory often spoken about in South Jamaica. The way young Kenneth would sit on the steps of a corner store, watching older hustlers roll dice and flash bills, never saying much, just studying. He wasn't reckless, wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of kid who needed to prove himself by shouting. He was patient. He was learning. And patience, in that world, was rarer than gold. By the mid-70s, the crack of gunfire had become as common as the crack of a baseball bat. The city was teetering. Queens was no exception. Kenneth's teenage years unfolded against this backdrop of chaos. Friends went to jail. Some never came back. Others turned into ghosts before they even hit 20, lost to addiction. And slowly, Kenneth's own choices began to shift. The boy who once watched from the sidelines started stepping onto the field. It began with small things, running errands for older hustlers, holding packages, keeping watch. The kind of work that didn't bring much money, but built trust. Kenneth wasn't trying to be the loudest kid on the block. He was trying to be the smartest. And the men above him noticed. What made him stand out wasn't just his willingness to work. It was the way he carried himself. Even as a teenager, there was a calmness about him, a sense of control. In a world where ego could get you killed, Kenneth seemed immune to the need for attention. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing knowledge, chasing power in its rawest form. But power doesn't come without cost. And in Queens during those years, the cost was written in blood. Kenneth would see it again and again. Ambition cut short by bullets, friends gunned down for a wrong look or a wrong move. The lesson was always the same: survive, adapt, or disappear. For Kenneth, survival meant sharpening his instincts, hiding his emotions, and calculating every step before he took it. At home, his parents still hoped. They wanted their son to choose differently, to rise above the noise of the streets. They pushed education, discipline, faith. But a boy can only resist the pull of his environment for so long. When the streets offer what your home cannot, money, status, protection, it becomes harder to say no. Kenneth didn't hate his parents' world. He just didn't believe it would save him. The South Jamaica of Kenneth's youth was like a pressure cooker. Poverty, drugs, and ambition all boiling together. And for someone like Kenneth, who could see patterns others missed, who understood that power wasn't about noise, but about structure, the path toward leadership began forming almost without him realizing it. He wasn't yet the supreme who would rule corners like a general. But the seeds were there, buried deep, waiting to be watered by time, opportunity, and temptation. Picture him at 17, lean, sharp-eyed, walking through a neighborhood that was both his home and his battlefield. Every cracked sidewalk told a story. Every corner held a choice. And every day, the line between survival and destruction grew thinner. This was not yet the empire. This was the foundation. The boy who would become supreme was still being shaped, carved by the streets that gave nothing for free. And soon, he would face the moment where patience turned into ambition, where watching turned into acting. The city was ready. The streets were hungry. And Kenneth McGriff, whether he admitted it or not, was already on his way to becoming something more than just another name in Queens. But the rise of a kingpin never begins with a crown. It begins with a choice. And Kenneth's choice was coming fast. The sirens came first. In South Jamaica, Queens, during the 1970s, they were not just a sound but a soundtrack, echoing through the cracked windows of tenements and across playgrounds where children tried to ignore them. For a boy like Kenneth McGriff, they were a reminder that the streets were never quiet for long. Every few blocks, the wail meant another overdose, another raid, another body slipping out of the shadows and into history. By the time Kenneth reached his teenage years, the community he called home was already collapsing under the weight of heroin. The drug didn't just pass through South Jamaica. It rooted itself deep, the way ivy strangles a building until the bricks beneath it can no longer be seen. Families that once fought to keep their heads above water were now drowning, not in bills or poverty, but in needles scattered on linoleum floors. A mother's purse rattled with spoons and caps instead of groceries. Fathers who once worked the factories or drove cabs now vanished in alleyways, their footsteps echoing only when they came home broke and glassy-eyed. The older kids, the ones Kenneth once looked up to for their sharp sneakers and quick hands, were starting to disappear too. Some were claimed by prison, others by the quiet suffocation of addiction. What had looked glamorous on the corner when he was a boy was revealing its darker side. The chains, the cash, the cars were often borrowed time, glittering bait on a hook that always dragged men down. Still, for every one who vanished, another stepped up to replace them. That was the way of the block. South Jamaica wasn't just dangerous. It was alive with danger, humming with the kind of energy that makes every day feel like a gamble. On summer nights, the air was thick with music from open windows, the bass of funk and soul tracks rattling the sidewalks, but layered over it were the sharp cracks of deals going down. You could see money change hands faster than the dice rolled in back alleys. And in the middle of it all, young Kenneth walked with his eyes wide open, watching how the streets functioned like a machine, chaotic, but with rules all its own. Local gangs had grown bolder, more organized. They weren't just kids protecting a block with fists and bottles anymore. They were crews with hierarchies, with soldiers and bosses, with codes of loyalty that were enforced in blood. These were not the mafia families that dominated other parts of New York. This was homegrown, raw, fueled by desperation and ambition. And in neighborhoods like South Jamaica, the line between a crew and a family blurred. Loyalty was survival. Betrayal was death. Kenneth wasn't blind to the risks. He saw the mothers crying outside brownstone stoops, saw the white sheets pulled over bodies in the street. But he also saw something else, power. In a world where jobs were gone and schools were broken, the men who controlled the corners seemed untouchable. They moved like kings through the neighborhood, commanding fear and respect in equal measure. For a boy raised in scarcity, that kind of power wasn't just tempting, it was magnetic. The heroin trade had cracked the city wide open, and Queens was no exception. Dealers didn't just sell drugs, they shaped the rhythm of life. Whole blocks pulsed to the beat of their economy. A kid might go to school hungry, but he knew the corner man had pockets full of cash by sundown. The contrast was sharp, brutal, impossible to ignore. Kenneth, with his quiet patience and sharp eyes, absorbed every detail. The way money traveled from addict to dealer to supplier. The way violence was used like punctuation in a sentence, sharp and decisive. There were stories whispered about certain corners, about stairwells where no one dared walk at night. Even the cops avoided some blocks unless they came in numbers. South Jamaica was building its reputation, one body at a time, as one of the most dangerous corners of New York. And in that crucible, Kenneth began to feel the heat. He had friends whose brothers had already been swept up by the life. Some had vanished into RICOs before they were even old enough to drink. Others had turned their mother's kitchens into cutting spots, the stench of vinegar and burnt chemicals hanging in the air long after the deals were done. Kenneth didn't jump in head first. Not yet. He kept his distance, but not too far. He was a shadow, studying, waiting. What haunted the neighborhood wasn't just the violence. It was the slow erosion of hope. Teachers fought to keep classrooms from unraveling, but kids fell asleep at their desks after nights filled with chaos. Churches tried to hold on to their congregations, but the pews emptied as families broke apart. The heroin trade didn't just poison bodies. It poisoned futures. And yet, even in this chaos, there was a strange sense of order. The corners belonged to someone. The buildings belonged to someone. Everyone knew which blocks were safe and which were not, which crews had the most muscle, and which were just playing at the game. It was a city within a city, a kingdom carved out of poverty and concrete. Kenneth saw it clearly. Whoever held control of that kingdom held everything that mattered. The South Jamaica of the 1970s was a pressure cooker, with heroin flooding in, with gangs growing sharper, with families breaking down. It was inevitable that someone would rise from the ashes, someone who could organize the chaos, someone who could turn the mess into a machine. Kenneth may not have known it yet, but every step he took, every corner he passed, was pulling him closer to that role. The world around him was teaching lessons no classroom ever could. Violence was a teacher. Addiction was a teacher. The men who ruled the blocks were teachers too, showing him that power wasn't about noise, but about strategy, about knowing when to wait and when to strike. And Kenneth, patient as ever, listened to them all. At night, when the street lights buzzed and the sidewalks emptied, he would walk past the burnt-out shells of cars, past the apartments where whole families had vanished into the haze of heroin, and he would feel it, the weight of possibility. He wasn't just another kid anymore. He was a young man, standing at the edge of something much bigger. The block was changing him. The streets of South Jamaica were shaping him the way a sculptor shapes stone, slowly, brutally, with blows that left scars. He wasn't supreme yet, but the streets were carving him into the man who would be. And soon, the small-time hustles and corner crews would no longer be enough. The city was about to shift again, and Kenneth was waiting, watching, ready to step into the chaos. Because the streets of South Jamaica didn't just raise him. They prepared him. And what was coming next would test whether the boy who had once sat quietly on corner steps could rise to command the very empire those corners fed. The first move was near. The machine was already in motion. And Kenneth McGriff was about to decide whether he would simply survive it or control it. The first time Kenneth McGriff held real money in his hands, money that didn't come from mowing lawns or odd jobs, it burned. Not in the physical sense, bills don't catch fire on their own, but in the way it lit something inside him that refused to go out. He had seen money before, of course, but this was different. This was fast money, street money. The kind that moved through hands like water, but always seemed to make certain men shine. Men Kenneth had been watching for years from the sidelines. Now it was his turn to feel the weight of it, and the streets whispered a promise he could not ignore. It started small. It almost always does. Kenneth wasn't yet running corners or calling shots. He was just another teenager in South Jamaica, trying to find a way out of the suffocating trap of poverty. His first hustles were simple, low-risk jobs that older boys passed down when they needed someone trustworthy. Carrying packages from one block to another. Holding a stash when heat was coming down. Acting as a lookout when deals went down in crowded stairwells. To outsiders, it might have seemed minor, almost harmless. But in Queens during those years, these minor roles were steps onto a ladder that climbed straight into the heart of the drug trade. Kenneth had a gift that set him apart. He was calm. While other kids bragged about the scraps of money they made or the fights they got into, Kenneth kept quiet. He didn't draw attention to himself. That made him valuable. In the streets, the loud ones often went down first. The quiet ones lasted. And Kenneth's silence was a currency in itself. The drug game was everywhere, humming like electricity through the neighborhood. Heroin was the main product, its powder packaged in a glassine envelopes, stamped with brand names, as if it were a legal commodity. One block sold Red Devil, another sold Top Dog. It was business, brutal but structured, and Kenneth was beginning to understand that. He watched how supply chains worked, how product came in from distant sources and trickled down to corners, how loyalty was enforced, how betrayal was punished. It was like watching a living organism breathe, and Kenneth, sharp-eyed and patient, was learning its anatomy. At first, he wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing survival. His family's finances were stretched thin, and the jobs available to a young black teenager in South Jamaica were few and far between. Washing dishes for a few dollars an hour could not compare to the $50 bills flashing on the corners. The math was brutal, undeniable. The streets paid more, faster, and carried a strange kind of respect that no straight job could ever offer. Still, every move carried risk. Kenneth knew it. He felt it in the way his heart raced when he slipped a small package into his pocket, in the way he scanned every streetlight for cops, in the way his mother's eyes lingered on him a little too long some nights, as if she knew but didn't want to say it aloud. Fear and ambition danced together inside him, a dangerous rhythm that pushed him forward even when caution screamed to hold back. The first time he tasted profit, real profit, was when he flipped a small bundle for himself. Not just holding it for someone else, not just acting as muscle, but making the play on his own. It was petty by the standards of the men he admired. Just a few dozen envelopes, a handful of addicts exchanging crumpled bills. But when the night ended and the money sat heavy in his pocket, Kenneth realized something profound. The streets could provide more in a single evening than a week of grinding at a legitimate job. It was intoxicating, and it was only the beginning. Petty crime in South Jamaica wasn't just about money. It was about status. A teenager with clean sneakers and a crisp new jacket was making a statement. He was connected. He was moving up. Kenneth felt that pull too. He liked the way respect followed him when people saw he had cash to spend. He liked that he no longer had to look at every price tag with hesitation. For the first time, the boy who had grown up watching others shine was beginning to glow himself. But there was danger in that glow. For every step Kenneth took deeper into hustling, the stakes grew sharper. The police were cracking down harder, and rival crews were always watching, waiting for weakness. To Kenneth, though, it felt less like risk and more like inevitability. The world he lived in offered two clear paths: struggle in poverty or hustle in the streets. He chose the latter, and every choice after seemed to lock him deeper into that decision. The petty hustles evolved quickly. Kenneth began building small crews of his own, kids his age who looked to him for direction. He had a knack for organizing, for keeping people in line without raising his voice. Where others lost control, Kenneth maintained order. It was a quality older hustlers noticed, and it marked him as different. He wasn't just another kid chasing quick cash. He was building something, even if it was small for now. The profitability of the drug trade revealed itself in stark terms. Kenneth could see it in the way corners transformed overnight. A block once filled with kids playing ball could become a hot spot for dealers and buyers, generating thousands of dollars in a single day. Money poured in like a tide, fast and relentless, but it always seemed to vanish just as quickly, spent on cars, clothes, parties. Kenneth studied this too. He saw the waste, the lack of discipline, and he promised himself he would be different. He would not just make money. He would keep it, multiply it, use it to build power. But ambition carries a shadow. The more Kenneth hustled, the more he risked drawing the wrong kind of attention. Cops patrolled heavier. Rival crews tested boundaries. And his family, though silent, surely felt the shift. His mother's worry, his father's quiet disappointment. These were weights Kenneth carried, even as he pushed deeper into the game. The streets, though, have a way of silencing doubt. The thrill of fast money, the rush of being respected, the addictive sense of control, it all drowned out the whispers of consequence. Kenneth was young, smart, and hungry, and the streets had plenty to feed him. Still, every corner had its ghosts. He knew kids who had started just like him, running errands, making small flips, only to end up face down in alleyways or rotting in cells. The lesson was clear, but Kenneth believed he was different. He believed patience, intelligence, and discipline would keep him alive where others had fallen. It was a dangerous confidence, but it was also the seed of the empire he would one day build. By the late 70s, Kenneth was no longer just dabbling. Petty crime had become a profession, a training ground that taught him not just how to hustle, but how to lead. He was carving out a reputation, one careful move at a time, and though the money was still small compared to what was coming, it was enough to show him what was possible. The drug trade wasn't just profitable, it was transformative. It could turn a boy from South Jamaica into something more. But transformations don't come without cost. And Kenneth was about to learn that the deeper he went, the harder it would be to climb back out. The streets had given him a taste, and now they wanted more. The question was no longer whether he would hustle. The question was how far he would go. And as the shadows of Queens grew darker, Kenneth McGriff was preparing to step fully into them. Because petty crime was just the opening act. The real story, the rise of Supreme, was waiting in the next move. The gunfire wasn't random anymore. It had a rhythm now, a kind of order that only made sense if you understood who was pulling the strings. By the early 1980s, South Jamaica had stopped being just a neighborhood ravaged by heroin and poverty. It had become a battlefield carved into territories, each corner claimed by someone who thought they could control it. But out of all the small crews that hustled and fought over scraps, one name began to rise above the rest: the Supreme Team. It didn't appear overnight, not like a flash in the dark. It started with whispers, with a handful of young men who moved differently. Kenneth McGriff, no longer just the quiet observer or the petty hustler, had begun to shape something far bigger than himself. He understood what most kids on the block didn't. Power wasn't just about muscle or money. It was about structure. It was about creating a system where everyone knew their role, where loyalty was enforced, and where ambition was rewarded only if it didn't threaten the throne. The streets had taught him patience, and now he used it like a weapon. He pulled in people he trusted, friends, family, loyalists who had proven they wouldn't break under pressure. Together, they formed the backbone of what would become one of the most notorious drug crews in New York history. The name itself carried weight. Supreme. It wasn't just a nickname anymore. It was a declaration. It meant highest, untouchable, above all others. And that was exactly the image Kenneth wanted the world to see. The Supreme Team was not sloppy. They weren't just corner boys handing out dime bags and stairwells. They operated like a corporation disguised as a gang. There were levels to it: foot soldiers who sold the product, lieutenants who managed the blocks, enforcers who made sure rules were obeyed, and higher-ups who handled money and strategy. At the top sat Kenneth, calm, calculating, a general watching his army expand block by block. What set them apart was discipline. In a world where most crews burned out quickly, fighting each other, flashing too much cash, drawing too much heat, the Supreme Team thrived because Kenneth treated the streets like a chessboard. Every move was deliberate. Every piece had a role. Violence was not random with them. It was surgical, precise, unleashed only when necessary to remind the world who held power. Still, beneath that structure was fear. Foot soldiers knew what happened if they stole, if they lied, if they disrespected the chain of command. Punishments weren't just warnings. They were examples. Stories of brutal beatings, of bodies left bleeding in stairwells, spread quickly through Queens. The Supreme Team ruled not only with profit, but with terror, and everyone in South Jamaica understood the consequences of crossing them. The money came fast. Crack cocaine had erupted across the city like wildfire, replacing heroin as the drug of choice. It was cheaper, more addictive, easier to distribute, and far more profitable. The Supreme Team seized on it like sharks sensing blood in the water. Within months, their operation was pulling in thousands of dollars a day. Within years, millions flowed through their hands. The corners of South Jamaica changed. Where once you saw kids playing stickball, now you saw young men with pockets stuffed with cash, cars parked curbside with rims gleaming, gold chains swinging under streetlights. The Supreme Team's influence was everywhere, visible in the way they dressed, the way they talked, the way they moved through the neighborhood like they owned it, because in many ways, they did. Kenneth wasn't just building an empire. He was building an image. He made sure the team was seen in expensive cars, draped in designer clothes, living the kind of life that drew young kids toward them like moths to flame. In a neighborhood starved of role models, the Supreme Team became both a warning and a temptation. Parents told their children to stay away, but the lure of easy money and respect was too strong. Some listened. Most didn't. But with success came attention. The police knew the Supreme Team by name, even if they couldn't yet prove the scale of the operation. Undercover agents began haunting the corners, snapping photos, recording deals, trying to map out the hierarchy. Still, the team remained difficult to crack. Kenneth had drilled discipline into his soldiers, making sure they understood that silence was survival. Talking to cops was not just betrayal, it was suicide. The violence escalated as rivals tried to muscle in. Smaller crews thought they could challenge Supreme's control. They learned quickly how wrong they were. The Supreme Team had enforcers who answered disrespect with bullets. Shootouts lit up Queens like war zones. Residents would peek through their curtains and see bodies sprawled on sidewalks, chalk lines marking the end of another lesson in loyalty. The message was always clear: There was no room for weakness. And yet, despite the bloodshed, there was admiration. In South Jamaica, the Supreme Team carried a strange kind of respect. They were feared, yes, but they were also seen as providers. They gave handouts at times, helping families pay rent, handing out cash at parties, buying school supplies for kids. It was a twisted Robin Hood image, one that blurred the lines between villain and protector. For many in the neighborhood, the government had abandoned them long ago. The Supreme Team, brutal as they were, felt closer to home. Inside the crew, loyalty to Kenneth was absolute. He wasn't a tyrant screaming orders. He led with a calmness that unnerved both allies and enemies. When he spoke, people listened. When he made decisions, no one questioned them. His ability to balance discipline with charisma kept the Supreme Team from collapsing under its own weight, at least in the beginning. But success is a dangerous drug of its own. The bigger the crew grew, the harder it became to control. Money poured in faster than it could be laundered. Younger members, drunk on cash and power, began drawing the wrong kind of attention with flashy cars and reckless violence. And law enforcement, once on the sidelines, was starting to sharpen its focus. For Kenneth, the challenge was no longer just building an empire. It was keeping it alive. The Supreme Team was now too big to ignore, too loud to hide. Every dollar earned, every corner controlled, painted a bigger target on their backs. Still, in those early years, the team felt untouchable. They had the money, the muscle, the organization. Other crews fell apart, but the Supreme Team only grew stronger. And Kenneth, the boy who once watched from stoops, was now the king of South Jamaica. But kings, no matter how powerful, always face betrayal, ambition, and enemies who wait for the perfect moment to strike. The Supreme Team had been born in fire, built on discipline and fear. But the same streets that crowned them would soon test them in ways no structure, no hierarchy could withstand. Because in the drug game, the rise always comes before the fall. And for Kenneth McGriff, the cracks in his empire were already beginning to form. The sound of glass shattering wasn't always from bottles in the street. In the early 1980s, it came from something far smaller, more dangerous. Tiny glass vials, dropped to the pavement, stepped on and crushed, littered like confetti across South Jamaica. Each vial was a marker of a new era, one that would turn New York upside down. Crack had arrived, and once it took hold, nothing was the same again. Before crack, heroin had ruled the streets, slow and devastating, but limited by its price and its method of use. Crack changed everything. It was cocaine broken down into crystal rocks, cooked cheap, sold cheaper, and smoked for a high that was faster and more intense than anything before. A $5 bill was all it took to escape reality for a few minutes. And in a neighborhood where $5 could be easier to find than hope, crack spread like wildfire. Kenneth McGriff and the Supreme Team were positioned perfectly when the epidemic hit. They already had structure, discipline, and manpower. They already controlled territory. Crack was not just another product. It was a revolution in the drug trade. It multiplied profits in ways no one could have predicted. A kilogram of cocaine, once expensive and slow to sell in powder form, could be cooked down into thousands of small rocks, each sold for a fraction of the price. The math was staggering. Where a hustler once made thousands, he can now make tens of thousands. Where he made tens, he can make hundreds. Crack turned street corners into gold mines. The demand was endless. Addicts pawned jewelry, stole from family, robbed strangers just to get another hit. The lines on the blocks stretched long into the night. People desperate, shaking, clutching crumpled bills in their fists. It was ugly, raw, heartbreaking. And, for the Supreme Team, it was also opportunity. They flooded South Jamaica with product, keeping supply steady, prices stable, and control absolute. Money poured in like a flood. Some nights, a single corner would make more in a few hours than a working-class family saw in a month. The cash came so fast it had to be stacked, bagged, laundered through fronts. Luxury cars began lining the streets. Fur coats, gold chains, designer clothes, signs of wealth draped over young men barely out of their teens. Kenneth, always careful to project power, made sure the team's success was visible. They weren't just dealers, they were rulers of their domain. But crack did more than make men rich. It transformed the streets into war zones. Addicts weren't the only ones desperate. Rival crews wanted in. Corners became battlefields, and every block was worth killing for. The Supreme Team's discipline gave them an advantage, but violence was unavoidable. Gunfire echoed through Queens like thunder, claiming lives young and old. Innocent people caught bullets meant for others. Children stepped over bodies on their way to school. The neighborhood's heart beat to the rhythm of money and gunshots, and fear became as common as air. Kenneth understood the stakes. He knew the crack era would draw more attention from law enforcement than anything before. But he also knew pulling back wasn't an option. The profits were too immense, the power too intoxicating. So he doubled down, reinforcing his structure, keeping lieutenants in line, ensuring that the money flowed upward and the violence stayed controlled, at least as much as it could be in a business built on chaos. The epidemic changed the way hustlers thought too. Crack wasn't just a product. It was a system. Addicts came back every 15 minutes, every half hour, desperate for another hit. Dealers didn't need to chase customers anymore. The customers came to them. It was like running a store that never closed, with lines out the door 24 hours a day. For the Supreme Team, it was a perfect storm. They had the manpower, the supply, and the organization to keep those doors open. And every night, the cash piled higher. But with wealth came ego. Younger members, drunk on money and status, began flashing too much, partying too loud, showing off in ways that drew eyes. The cars got bigger. The jewelry got heavier. The parties grew wilder. South Jamaica was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a stage, and the Supreme Team was performing for an audience that included cops, rivals, and federal agents who were beginning to circle. Still, inside the crew, loyalty held for now. Kenneth remained the calm, at the center of the storm. His presence kept the machine running. His discipline kept the chaos from spilling too far. He had built something few others could, an empire within an epidemic, an organization that seemed as unstoppable as the drug itself. Yet the toll on the community was devastating. Families collapsed under the weight of addiction. Children wandered streets alone, parents lost to the pipe. Crime skyrocketed, not just from dealers but from addicts desperate to feed their habit. The same product that made the Supreme Team rich was tearing South Jamaica apart piece by piece. It was a paradox Kenneth could not ignore, even if he did not stop. The same neighbors who sometimes praised him, who admired his power, also cursed his name as their families crumbled. The government noticed too. Newspapers screamed about crack like it was a plague. Politicians declared war on drugs, pushing harsher laws, longer sentences, more aggressive policing. The DEA, the FBI, and local task forces began pouring resources into Queens, determined to take down the crews who had turned entire neighborhoods into fortresses of crime. For the first time, the Supreme Team's empire was not just a local issue. It was on the radar of the nation. And still, the money kept flowing. Every day felt like a contradiction. On one hand, South Jamaica was unraveling. On the other, the Supreme Team was thriving, richer and more feared than ever before. It was as if two realities existed at once, the suffering of the community and the glory of the crew, both feeding each other, both impossible to separate. Kenneth was no longer just a hustler. He was supreme in every sense. The name fit now, carried on whispers through the streets, through prisons, through law enforcement reports. To some, he was a hero. To others, a villain. But to everyone, he was undeniable. The crack epidemic had given him everything: money, power, reputation. But it also set the stage for his downfall. The higher the pile of cash grew, the bigger the target on his back became. Rivals wanted him gone. Cops wanted him caged. The government wanted him erased. And yet, in those years, it felt like he couldn't be touched. The Supreme Team ruled South Jamaica like kings, their empire built on smoke and stone. But every empire has cracks, And every ruler faces the day when power begins to slip. The question wasn't whether the crack epidemic would make Kenneth McGriff rich. It already had. The question was how long he could hold on to that throne before the weight of money, violence, and attention dragged him down. Because the higher you climb, the further there is to fall. And Kenneth was still climbing. The streets whispered about it in hushed tones, the way people speak of something larger than life but too dangerous to name out loud. The Supreme Team wasn't just another gang hustling on corners. It was a machine, sleek, organized, and ruthless. In the early 1980s, as crack money poured into South Jamaica, Kenneth McGriff built an operation that looked less like a neighborhood crew and more like a corporation, except this corporation was enforced with fear, fueled by addiction, and decorated in gold chains and designer suits. To understand their methods, you have to picture the streets like a marketplace. Every corner was a store, every hallway a cash register. But unlike ordinary businesses, there were no receipts, no customer service desks, no refunds. The Supreme Team moved product with an efficiency that rivaled legitimate companies. Only their advertising was word of mouth, and their quality control was enforced at the end of the gun. Kenneth ran things from the top down. He wasn't out on corners hawking vials himself. That work was for soldiers. His job was control. He established a hierarchy where everyone had a role, and no one stepped outside their lane. Street-level dealers worked the blocks. Lieutenants oversaw them, collected money, and reported up. Enforcers made sure rules were followed and disrespect was answered swiftly. And above them all, Kenneth directed it like a conductor guiding an orchestra, calm, steady, always watching. The team's distribution was smart. Product didn't just get tossed out carelessly. They used apartments as stash houses, hidden spots where drugs were packaged and stored. Dealers were supplied in shifts, like employees working hours at a factory. When one crew finished, another took their place, ensuring the flow of crack never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, South Jamaica buzzed with activity. Addicts came at all hours, and the Supreme Team never let them down. Intimidation was part of the system. Rules weren't suggestions, they were law. If someone stole product, skimmed cash, or betrayed the team, punishment was brutal. Beatings weren't just private corrections, they were public messages. Bodies left in the open served as reminders to everyone else about the cost of disloyalty. It was fear woven into the business model, as essential as supply and demand. But Kenneth also understood psychology. Violence kept people in line, yes, but respect kept them loyal. He made sure his soldiers ate. He let them share in the wealth, at least enough to feel invested. He hosted parties, threw money around, bought drinks, covered bills. He gave the illusion of family, of belonging, and in a world where most young men had little to call their own, that mattered. The team was more than a crew. It was identity, it was purpose, it was power. Luxury was another weapon. Kenneth knew appearances mattered. He and his top lieutenants drove flashy cars, BMWs, Mercedes Cadillacs with custom rims. They wore suits sharp enough to cut, gold chains thick as rope, watches that glimmered under streetlights. This wasn't just indulgence. It was marketing. Every young kid in South Jamaica could see what the Supreme Team had, and envy is a powerful motivator. The message was clear: stay broke with a 9-to-5, or step into this world and shine. Yet beneath the glamour was strategy. Money wasn't left lying around in shoe boxes forever. Kenneth invested in legitimate businesses as fronts, car dealerships, record stores, real estate deals. These were ways to launder dirty cash, to disguise the river of money pouring from the streets. He wasn't just stacking bills. He was building an empire that blurred the line between illegal and legitimate. The methods extended to communication too. Kenneth didn't waste words. Orders were passed carefully, coded, often through intermediaries. Loose talk was dangerous, and everyone knew it. The Supreme Team wasn't careless like some rivals who bragged loudly and drew heat. They moved with discipline. They moved like professionals, and that discipline kept them alive longer than most. But no matter how smooth the system looked, the foundation was still blood. Enforcers were the spine of the team. They were the ones who made sure no one challenged Kenneth's authority, who settled disputes with fists or bullets. They didn't just keep the crew in line. They defended territory from rivals who constantly tested boundaries. Shootouts became part of daily life, echoes of gunfire rattling windows, kids diving to the floor when it broke out. It was survival disguised as business. And yet, in those moments of chaos, Kenneth's calm stood out. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He weighed every move with the patience of a chess player, calculating 3 steps ahead. That was his gift. Not brute force, but control. Control of money, of people, of perception. To him, the streets weren't random. They were a game, and he had figured out the rules better than anyone else. Still, the cost was undeniable. The same methods that made the Supreme Team strong also poisoned the community around them. Parents whispered their fear, watching their sons get recruited, their daughters caught in the orbit of fast money. Addicts stumbled through blocks that once held families and children. Violence became so routine that sirens no longer startled anyone. It was the sound of normal life. Inside the crew, not everyone carried Kenneth's composure. Some grew reckless, blinded by cash and power. They bought cars they couldn't hide, threw parties that drew too much attention, carried guns like toys. Kenneth tried to rein it in. But discipline has limits when ambition spreads like wildfire. Cracks began forming, even as the empire reached its peak. Law enforcement was watching closely now. The methods that once made the Supreme Team untouchable were becoming liabilities. Stash houses were raided. Soldiers were flipped into informants. Undercover agents blended into the night, recording transactions, mapping out the hierarchy Kenneth had built. The very structure that made the team so powerful also gave investigators a blueprint. But in those years, it still felt like Kenneth held all the cards. The money was endless, the loyalty strong, the fear effective. The Supreme Team was at its height, a living symbol of what discipline and organization could achieve in the drug trade. And Kenneth, calm at the center, seemed almost untouchable. Almost. Because the same methods that built his empire also made it impossible to hide. The bigger the team grew, the louder its reputation echoed beyond Queens. And reputations have a way of attracting enemies. On the streets, in rival crews, and in the halls of law enforcement. The question wasn't whether Kenneth's methods worked. They did. The question was how long he could keep the machine running before it devoured itself. And, as the crack era surged forward, the weight of that question pressed heavier every day. The blue lights cut through the night like blades. Sirens wailed, tires screeched, and shadows scattered in every direction. For the people of South Jamaica, this was no longer just the sound of an overdose or a street fight. It was the sound of war. The police weren't just passing through anymore. They were coming in heavy, night after night, determined to break apart the empire that Kenneth McGriff and the Supreme Team had built. And for the first time, the crew could feel the weight of something larger than rival gangs pressing down on them. The streets weren't just dangerous because of bullets now. They were dangerous because the law had turned its gaze fully on them. Law enforcement had been aware of the Supreme Team for years. You couldn't run a crew that visible, that loud, without catching attention. But at first, the police underestimated them. To the NYPD, they were just another gang selling drugs in Queens, one of many in a city drowning in crime. It wasn't until the crack epidemic exploded, until the money and bodies began piling up, that investigators realized they weren't looking at just another crew. They were looking at something bigger, something structured, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. Detectives began working nights in unmarked cars, sitting quietly on corners with binoculars, watching the endless parade of addicts line up. They documented who stood where, who collected money, who delivered product. They mapped out the hierarchy Kenneth had built, block by block, trying to piece together a picture of the machine. And the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't chaos. This was business. Ruthless business. The DEA joined in, bringing federal resources. Wiretaps were authorized. Phones clicked with hidden ears. Conversations that once seemed safe were suddenly evidence, collected and stored, building a case one word at a time. Undercover officers walked into the neighborhoods disguised as buyers, slipping crumpled bills across palms, taking mental notes of faces and routines. Every transaction was a brick in the wall that law enforcement was slowly constructing around the Supreme Team. But Kenneth's crew wasn't blind. They felt the heat. They saw the same cars circling too often, the same faces lingering too long. They knew the cops were watching, and it made paranoia spread like smoke. Orders went out to tighten up. No careless talk. No sloppy handling of product. If someone even looked like they might be a snitch, suspicion alone could be a death sentence. Still, arrests began piling up. Street-level dealers, the lowest on the ladder, were picked off first. One by one, they disappeared into the system, booked on possession or distribution charges. For the Supreme Team, this wasn't a major loss. They were easily replaced. But for the NYPD, each arrest was another opportunity to squeeze information, to turn a soldier into an informant. Some cracked under the pressure, terrified of spending decades in prison. Others held strong, more afraid of what the Supreme Team would do to them on the outside if they talked. The tension between cops and crew wasn't just in courtrooms or interrogation rooms. It played out in the streets, violent and raw. Raids on stash houses turned into firefights. Drug busts spilled into full-blown chases, with officers tearing down stairwells and suspects leaping out of windows to escape. The Supreme Team wasn't just running from rivals anymore. They were running from the city itself. And every siren, every flashing light, was a reminder that the empire Kenneth had built was under siege. Yet despite the pressure, Kenneth himself remained calm. He had always been the eye of the storm, steady while chaos swirled around him. When soldiers panicked, he reassured them. When lieutenants worried about raids, he reminded them that the streets had always been a battlefield. In his mind, law enforcement was just another rival, another player on the board. And like every rival before, he believed he could outthink them. The problem was, the police weren't rivals playing the same game. They had resources the streets could never match. Databases, surveillance equipment, federal funding, endless manpower. The Supreme Team's discipline had made them strong, but it also made them visible. Their structure gave investigators a roadmap. And slowly, piece by piece, that map was being filled in. The community was caught in the middle. To some, the raids felt like salvation, the only hope of reclaiming their streets from the grip of crack. To others, it felt like invasion, police storming through doors, breaking down homes, terrorizing families who weren't even involved. Every raid left scars, physical and emotional, and resentment simmered on both sides. The police saw the community as hostile. The community saw the police as outsiders. And the Supreme Team thrived in that tension, presenting themselves as the only real power South Jamaica could count on. But behind closed doors, Kenneth knew the storm was growing. He could see it in the way cases were stacking, in the way raids were becoming more frequent, in the whispers that some of his men might be breaking under pressure. He had built his empire on discipline and fear, but even discipline has limits when the weight of the federal government bears down on you. Still, he refused to back down. Instead, he doubled down on security. Soldiers rotated more often. Conversations were kept shorter. Violence became sharper, harsher, and not just at rivals, but at anyone suspected of cooperating with police. It was a dangerous escalation, one that only deepened law enforcement's determination to shut them down. The early attempts to dismantle the crew had mixed results. Raids took out soldiers, but the machine kept running. Arrests disrupted supply, but the product always returned. Kenneth's calm leadership kept the Supreme Team afloat, but cracks were forming. And law enforcement, patient as ever, was waiting for the moment when those cracks became too wide to ignore. The streets of South Jamaica no longer belonged solely to the Supreme Team. They were now shared with the eyes of detectives, the ears of wiretaps, the pressure of prosecutors. Every move the crew made was shadowed by law enforcement. Every dollar earned tainted by the risk of seizure. Every deal another chance for betrayal. The war had shifted. It was no longer just survival against rivals. It was survival against the state itself. And in that clash, only one side could win. For Kenneth, the question wasn't whether the police were coming. He knew they were. The question was how long he could keep them at bay, how long he could hold on to power before the law finally closed in. Because when the city decides to hunt you, there are only two endings: prison or death. And Kenneth McGriff was beginning to feel the walls closing around him. The screams were muffled, but the crying was not. A mother knelt on the cracked steps of a South Jamaica apartment building, begging her son through the locked door to let her in. He had pawned her television, stolen her jewelry, and vanished for days at a time. Now he was inside with a pipe, lost to a drug that had swallowed him whole. Outside, neighbors shook their heads, but didn't intervene. They had seen it before. They would see it again. This was the other side of the Supreme Team's reign. Not gold chains and luxury cars, but broken homes and children left behind. The Supreme Team's empire had turned South Jamaica into something strange, something contradictory. On one hand, the crew brought devastation. Crack cocaine swept through the neighborhood like a hurricane, pulling families apart, draining bank accounts, filling funeral homes. It created addicts out of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, people who had once held steady jobs, who had once believed in tomorrow. Now tomorrow was a word they barely used. They lived only for the next hit. On the other hand, Kenneth McGriff and his team carried themselves like kings. They gave handouts, covered rent for some families, bought Christmas toys for kids whose parents couldn't afford them. They were visible at block parties, smiling, laughing, showing off the wealth the streets had given them. For some, it felt like they cared more than the government ever had. In a community long abandoned by politicians and starved of opportunity, the Supreme Team's generosity, even if it was funded by poison, looked almost noble. It was this contradiction that defined their impact. People feared them, but they also admired them. They despised what the crack epidemic had done, but they respected the men who seemed untouchable, who had risen out of the same poverty and carved out power for themselves. It was a twisted Robin Hood image, one that blurred the line between villain and savior. And Kenneth knew exactly how to play that role. He understood image better than most. He knew the importance of being seen, not just as a dealer, but as a figure of authority. He wasn't just running corners. He was building an aura. He gave money at church events, bought food for block cookouts, and made sure families struggling under the weight of poverty got something from him. To those families, the money was real. The groceries were real. The relief was real. They didn't always care where it came from. But even as he played benefactor, the streets around him sank deeper into despair. Children walked to school past addicts slumped on stoops. Parks became gathering spots for dealers instead of kids. Violence was constant, gunfire echoing at night, bodies appearing on sidewalks, mothers wailing as police pulled sheets over their sons. Fear became routine. It was woven into daily life, a background noise that people stopped noticing, the way one stops noticing the hum of a refrigerator after a while. The Supreme Team's presence created a strange kind of order too. Everyone knew who controlled the blocks. Everyone knew which corners belonged to them, which ones were off limits. That control kept rival crews at bay, but it also created an invisible boundary around the neighborhood. Outsiders rarely came in. Locals learned to keep their heads down, to move carefully, to avoid saying too much. The Supreme Team's shadow loomed over everything, unspoken but undeniable. For young people in South Jamaica, the impact was most visible. They saw the money, the cars, the respect. Teachers preached education, but classrooms looked pale compared to the glow of street power. A diploma promised struggle. The streets promised instant wealth. And the Supreme Team became role models, for better or worse. Kids idolized them, imitated them, dreamed of joining them. The cycle was self-sustaining. Every addict who fell created demand. Every hustler who was arrested opened a spot. Every child who watched in awe became a potential recruit. Still, behind the admiration, resentment festered. Some families cursed Kenneth's name, blaming him for the chaos that had consumed their loved ones. They saw through the handouts, the block parties, the smiles. To them, He was no savior. He was the man who had brought destruction to their doorsteps, who had gotten rich while their children wasted away. These voices were quieter, drowned out by the glamour of fast money, but they were there, and they carried a bitterness that would never fade. The duality was everywhere. The same man who bought sneakers for a neighborhood basketball team was also responsible for the violence that left bloodstains on the same court. The same crew that handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving was also the reason children sat alone on Christmas morning, waiting for parents who never came home. The contradictions were brutal, but that was the reality of South Jamaica under the Supreme Team's rule. Law enforcement saw it differently. To them, Kenneth wasn't a Robin Hood figure. He was a criminal mastermind, the architect of an empire that thrived on misery. They didn't see the groceries or the rent money. They saw the funerals, the overdoses, the shattered families. And as their investigations grew deeper, they began to understand how far the crew's influence stretched. It wasn't just the drug trade. It was the culture, the very way people saw themselves and their options in life. Inside the neighborhood, though, it was harder to separate the two. People lived in the contradiction every day. Some whispered their admiration. Others whispered their hatred. Most said nothing at all, too afraid or too weary to speak their minds. Silence was survival, and survival was the only law stronger than the Supreme Team. Kenneth thrived in that silence. He knew the neighborhood's love-hate relationship with him was a shield. As long as people kept quiet, law enforcement could only get so far. And as long as he provided just enough relief, just enough generosity, he could maintain that delicate balance. It was a dangerous line to walk, but he walked it with the same calm that had carried him from petty hustler to kingpin. The impact of the Supreme Team stretched beyond South Jamaica too. News reports painted them as symbols of the crack era, their name whispered in courtrooms and shouted in headlines. They became a story not just of one crew, but of an entire generation caught in the grip of a drug that reshaped America. And Kenneth, whether he wanted it or not, became the face of that story. But power built on contradictions is fragile. For every hand he fed, another was clenched in rage. For every child who admired him, another was left orphaned by his trade. The Robin Hood myth was powerful, but myths only last as long as people believe in them. And belief, like fear, has a way of eroding over time. As the years passed, the devastation grew harder to ignore. Addiction spread wider, violence claimed more lives, and the neighborhood's wounds deepened. The aura of respect that once surrounded the Supreme Team began to sour. People still admired the money, still feared the power, but the cost was too visible now. Too many funerals, too many broken homes, too many dreams lost. The empire Kenneth had built gave him everything he wanted: money, power, influence. But it also made him the villain of his own community, the man whose success was measured in the ruins of his neighbors' lives. And though he held the throne, the ground beneath him was beginning to crack. Because respect, like fear, only lasts as long as people are willing to believe. And South Jamaica was slowly, painfully, starting to see through the myth. The sound of the battering ram against the door was louder than gunfire. 1 hit, 2 hits. By the third, the frame cracked, splinters flying as boots thundered up the stairs. The Supreme Team had always expected rivals, always prepared for gunmen in the night. But this wasn't the streets. This was the state. NYPD, DEA, federal marshals, storming in with vests and shotguns, shouting commands over the chaos. For Kenneth McGriff, the moment had come. The empire he had built block by block, dollar by dollar, was finally colliding with the weight of the law. The raids weren't accidents. They were the result of years of surveillance, wiretaps, undercover work, and informants. Law enforcement had been patient, building their case carefully. They knew the Supreme Team wasn't just another crew. They knew dismantling it required more than street busts. They needed to take out the head. And Kenneth, calm as ever, had become their prime target. When the cuffs locked around his wrists, he didn't fight. Witnesses say he was composed, silent, staring straight ahead, as if he had always known this day would come. In truth, he probably had. No one runs a drug empire at that level without understanding the risks. The question had never been if, only when. His arrest sent shockwaves through South Jamaica. Crowds gathered outside, whispering, some in disbelief, others in satisfaction. To some, it was justice. Finally, the man who had flooded their neighborhood with poison was being dragged away. To others, it was tragedy, the fall of a figure they respected, feared, even admired. The Robin Hood image shattered under the flashing red and blue lights. But even in chains, Supreme carried an aura of power. The trial that followed was not just about Kenneth. It was about the government proving it could strike back against the crack epidemic, that it could bring down the giants who seemed untouchable. Prosecutors painted the Supreme Team as a violent syndicate, a drug empire built on blood. They brought forward witnesses, some former associates, some addicts, some undercover officers. Each testimony another nail in the coffin. The evidence piled up. Seized drugs, weapons, stacks of cash, recorded conversations. It was a mountain no lawyer could climb. Kenneth's defense tried to frame him as a victim of circumstance, a man from a broken neighborhood who had been demonized because of his success. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, that witnesses were unreliable, pressured by deals with prosecutors. But the weight of the case was too heavy, and the jury saw through it. They weren't just convicting a man. They were convicting an era. In the late 1980s, Kenneth McGriff was found guilty on federal drug charges. The sentence was harsh. Decades behind bars, his empire dismantled, his freedom gone. The courtroom was heavy that day. Reporters scribbled notes. Families of victims sighed in relief, and some of Kenneth's supporters wept openly. For them, it wasn't just the end of a man's reign. It was the end of a dream, twisted as it was, that someone from their world could rise above the system, even if it was through crime. Prison was a different kind of battlefield. Kenneth entered with a reputation, and in that world, reputation was everything. Behind walls of steel and concrete, he still carried weight. Other inmates respected him. Guards watched him closely. His name, Supreme, followed him like a shadow, a reminder of who he had been on the outside. But no matter how much respect he commanded, the reality was undeniable. He was caged, his empire left to crumble without him. Back in Queens, the Supreme Team struggled. Without its leader, the structure that had once made it strong began to fracture. Rivals circled, ready to carve up territory. Younger members, without Kenneth's discipline, grew reckless. Violence spiked, money slipped through fingers, and law enforcement pounced on the instability. The machine Kenneth had built was still powerful, but without him at the helm, it sputtered. For the community, his conviction was a double-edged sword. The streets felt a little safer, at least for a while. The endless fear of the Supreme Team's dominance weakened. But the damage was already done. Crack still haunted families, violence still lingered, and the scars of the epidemic were deep. Taking down one man couldn't undo years of devastation. And in a strange way, his absence left a void, an empty throne that others fought to fill, spilling more blood in the process. Kenneth himself never showed regret in public. If he felt it, he kept it buried. His silence was part of his power, a refusal to let the world see him break. In interviews and accounts, he was described as calm, almost detached, as if prison was simply another move on the chessboard. But deep down, he must have known the truth. The game had changed. The empire he once ruled was gone. The late 1980s marked the end of an era for South Jamaica. The Supreme Team's reign had been brutal, profitable, unforgettable. And Kenneth's conviction symbolized the government's determination to fight the war on drugs with everything it had. But wars are never won in a single battle. For every kingpin taken down, another rose to take his place. And even in prison, Kenneth's legend grew, whispered in rap lyrics, spoken in street corners, remembered as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of power. The fall of Supreme was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the man behind the myth would continue to cast a shadow from behind bars. His name was too heavy, his impact too deep, to fade away quietly. And as the gates clanged shut behind him, the world outside began to shift again. Crack still raged, crews still fought, and South Jamaica still bled. The empire was gone, but the hunger that had built it remained. For Kenneth, the question was no longer about money or power. It was about survival in a new world, about holding on to an identity when everything else had been stripped away. And as the years stretched ahead of him, one thing was clear. Supreme was down, but his story was far from over. Because legends don't end with a verdict. They linger, reshaping themselves, waiting for the next twist. And for Kenneth McGriff, the next twist was already waiting in the shadows. The cell door slammed shut with a metallic finality that echoed down the corridor. For most men, that sound marked the end. Freedom gone, life reduced to steel bars, bland food, and a number sewn onto a uniform. But for Kenneth McGriff, known on the streets as Supreme, prison was not an ending. It was simply a new stage. The empire he had built in South Jamaica had been stripped from him, but his reputation came with him inside. And in prison, reputation was currency. It was protection. It was power. The federal prison system in the late 1980s was filled with men like Kenneth, dealers, gang leaders, killers, hustlers who had been kings on the outside and were now reduced to inmates. Most of them arrived angry, bitter, scrambling to adjust to a world where the walls pressed in and the choices shrank to almost nothing. Some folded quickly, broken by isolation. Others fought constantly, desperate to cling to whatever scraps of respect they could find. Kenneth didn't either. He entered the prison system with the same composure that had carried him through the streets. Calm, focused, patient. That calmness mattered. Inside, men watched each other closely. Any sign of weakness could invite violence. Any show of fear could mark you as prey. But Kenneth gave them nothing. He carried himself with quiet authority, the same way he had on the streets, and word spread quickly. Supreme was here. The man who had ruled South Jamaica, the one whose name had become legend, was now walking the yard. And unlike most stories that get exaggerated over time, Kenneth's reputation was real enough to command respect the moment he arrived. Prison politics are a game of alliances and control. Gangs run the yards, racial lines divide the cafeterias, and every man learns fast where he belongs. Kenneth, though, didn't need to scramble for a place. His legend had carved one for him. Inmates gravitated toward him, some hoping for protection, others just wanting to be near the aura of power. Even guards recognized it, watching the way men deferred to him, the way his presence seemed to quiet tension before it exploded. He wasn't just another inmate. He was someone whose shadow stretched far beyond the prison walls. That shadow gave him influence. Messages still traveled in and out, sometimes through visits, sometimes through coded letters, sometimes through word of mouth passed between inmates being transferred. The Supreme team might have been weakened on the streets, but Kenneth's voice still carried weight. Orders were whispered, suggestions made, strategies discussed. It wasn't the same as running corners, but it kept him connected, kept him relevant, kept him supreme. Inside, he adapted. He studied men the same way he had studied the streets as a boy, watching who was reckless, who was disciplined, who could be trusted. He learned the rhythms of prison life, when to move, when to stay still, when to speak, when to remain silent. He saw that survival in prison wasn't just about fighting. It was about control, about mastering yourself in a place designed to break you. And Kenneth refused to break. There were moments of tension, of course. Prison is a place where violence can erupt over the smallest insult, where disputes over cigarettes or television channels can end in blood. But Kenneth rarely had to raise his hand. His name, his composure, his history, those were weapons sharper than any shank. Men thought twice before crossing him, not because he was the loudest, but because he was the calmest. Calm men in prison are dangerous. Calm men know they don't need to prove themselves. Still, even with influence, prison was prison. The nights were long, the walls suffocating, the routines grinding. Kenneth was cut off from the fast life he had once lived. The cars, the women, the endless flow of money. That loss must have weighed heavy, even if he never showed it. He had built himself into a king, and now he was just another body in a jumpsuit, eating cold meals under buzzing fluorescent lights. The contrast was brutal, but even stripped of luxury, he found ways to keep his dignity. He worked out, read, kept his mind sharp. He understood that time, like the streets, was something to be managed. What haunted him most, perhaps, wasn't the prison itself, but the world outside. The supreme team, without his steady hand, was crumbling. Rivals were carving up territory, younger members were getting reckless, and law enforcement was striking harder than ever. The empire he had once commanded like a general was being dismantled piece by piece. And there was little he could do but watch from behind bars as the kingdom he had built slipped through his fingers. But Kenneth was not forgotten. His name lived on in South Jamaica, whispered by hustlers who still remembered his discipline, his control, his rise to power. Even rappers began invoking his name, turning him into a symbol of the streets, a figure whose legend outgrew the man himself. Behind bars, he became myth, the kind of story young men told each other about what it meant to rule and what it meant to fall. And Kenneth leaned into that myth. He knew that power was not just about what you had, but about what people believed you had. Even locked away, he cultivated the aura of supreme, letting the legend carry on, letting it shield him inside and keep him relevant outside. He had lost his freedom, but not his influence. Prison gave him time to reflect too. He must have thought about the choices that led him there, about the boy who once sat quietly on a corner step, watching older hustlers and dreaming of more. Did he regret it? Did he wish he had chosen differently? If he did, he never said. Regret was not something Kenneth allowed others to see. To admit regret would be to admit defeat, and Supreme was not supposed to be defeated. Still, in the quiet of his cell, when the lights dimmed and the noise of the day finally faded, he must have felt it, the weight of time pressing down, the realization that power, no matter how great, cannot outrun the system forever. The walls were a reminder. The bars were a reminder. Every locked door was proof that even kings can be caged. But Kenneth's story didn't end in that cage. His time behind bars was only a pause, a chapter in a longer narrative. The streets outside kept moving, the drug trade kept evolving, and hip-hop, the culture that would later intertwine with his name, was beginning to explode. The world was changing, and though he was locked away, Kenneth still had a role to play. The legend of Supreme survived prison. It grew, reshaped by stories, by whispers, by songs. Inmates spoke of him with respect. Young hustlers on the outside invoked his name like a prayer. And Kenneth, patient as always, waited. He had been taken down, yes, but he had not been erased. Because behind bars, he had learned something crucial. Walls can cage a man, but they cannot cage a myth. And Supreme was no longer just a man. He was becoming something larger, something untouchable. Yet even as the legend grew, the reality remained. Time was ticking. His empire was gone. The world was shifting. And the question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. When he finally walked out of those gates, would the streets still belong to him? Or would he find that the throne he once held had already been claimed by someone else? The answer, waiting just beyond the prison walls, would determine the next chapter of Kenneth McGriff's story. The silence after his arrest was louder than the gunfire that had once rattled South Jamaica. For years, the neighborhood had pulsed to the rhythm of the Supreme Team's empire. Money flowing, addicts lined up, soldiers posted on corners with eyes sharp and weapons close. But when Kenneth McGriff, the calm at the center of the storm, was locked away, the beat changed. The machine he had built didn't stop overnight. It sputtered, coughed, and for a time, still ran. But without its architect, the gears began grinding against each other, and the cracks widened until the empire began tearing itself apart. The streets without Supreme were different. The aura of order he had enforced was gone. Soldiers who once followed his quiet discipline grew restless. Lieutenants argued, ambition flared, and loyalty thinned. Kenneth's greatest strength had always been control, keeping chaos contained, keeping violence calculated. Without him, the discipline eroded, and the Supreme Team turned inward, fighting battles not just with rivals but with themselves. At first, it was subtle. Corners still ran. Money still came in. People still whispered the name Supreme like it carried weight, even if he was behind bars. But slowly, the respect that had once held everything together began to fade. Younger soldiers, eager for power, started making moves without permission. Old grudges bubbled up, spilling into the open. The very hierarchy that had made the crew strong became a battlefield of its own. The violence escalated, not just against rivals, but within the team itself. Soldiers who once shared meals now eyed each other with suspicion. Some disappeared, their bodies turning up in alleyways or abandoned lots. Others flipped, turning to law enforcement out of fear for their lives, or to cut deals after arrests. Each betrayal, each gunshot, weakened the team a little more. The name Supreme still carried fear, but fear without leadership is like a storm without direction. Loud, chaotic, destructive, but never lasting. Rivals noticed the weakness. Other crews began circling like wolves, testing boundaries the Supreme Team had once defended with iron fists. Corners that had been untouchable were suddenly vulnerable. Shootouts erupted as challengers tried to carve pieces of territory for themselves. For the neighborhood, it was chaos. Gunfire became even more unpredictable, violence less controlled. The sense of order Kenneth had imposed, even through brutality, was gone, and the streets descended deeper into bloodshed. Law enforcement seized the moment. They knew the Supreme Team wasn't the same without its leader. Raids increased, arrests piled up, and cases stacked higher. Informants, once too scared to speak, now came forward, emboldened by the fractures inside the crew. Each name they gave, each address, each stash house, was another nail in the coffin. The Supreme Team had once seemed untouchable, but now, without Kenneth's discipline, it was bleeding from the inside out. The community felt the shift too. For all the destruction the crew had caused, there had been a strange sense of predictability under Kenneth. He had ruled with structure, and people understood the rules, even if they hated them. Without him, the chaos spread, and families already broken by addiction now faced even greater violence. Mothers mourned sons not only lost to crack, but to the crossfire of rivalries that spiraled out of control. The aura of Robin Hood-style respect that Kenneth had once cultivated evaporated. The team wasn't seen as providers anymore. They were just predators tearing at each other while the neighborhood paid the price. Inside prison, Kenneth must have heard the whispers. News traveled fast in that world. He would have known about the infighting, the betrayals, the raids. For a man who had built his reputation on control, hearing that the empire he created was unraveling must have cut deep. He had once orchestrated the streets like a symphony, each piece in harmony. Now, the music was gone, replaced with noise and violence. Some loyalists tried to hold things together in his absence, but without Supreme's presence, their authority was questioned. Ambition is a dangerous fire. It burns hottest when the throne is empty. And in South Jamaica, everyone could see that the throne Supreme, once occupied, was now vacant. The scramble to claim it only accelerated the crew's decline. The decline wasn't just about internal collapse. The world outside was changing too. The crack epidemic, once a gold rush, was drawing even harsher crackdowns. The war on drugs intensified, with mandatory minimum sentences and aggressive policing targeting entire neighborhoods. The risks of hustling grew higher, the rewards lower, and the fallout more devastating. The Supreme Team was a product of its time, but as the time shifted, its dominance slipped. For the people of South Jamaica, the fall of the Supreme Team was bittersweet. On one hand, their grip was loosening. The constant fear of a crew that once seemed larger than life was fading. On the other hand, the vacuum left behind didn't bring peace. It brought more chaos. Smaller crews, less disciplined, less organized, rushed in to fill the void. Violence spread wider, less predictable, less controlled. The monster was gone, but in its place came a swarm of smaller monsters, each hungry, each desperate, each more reckless than the last. The myth of Supreme, however, did not fade. Even as the crew crumbled, his name lingered like a ghost. For many, he remained the symbol of what the Supreme Team had been at its height: powerful, disciplined, untouchable. His absence only made the myth grow, a reminder that no matter how much the streets tore themselves apart, one man had once held it all together. But myths don't rebuild empires. They don't stop bullets or feed soldiers. And as the late 1980s bled into the early 90s, the Supreme Team was a shadow of what it had once been. The decline was slow, painful, inevitable. The empire had fallen, not with a single shot, but with 1,000 cuts: infighting, betrayal, law enforcement, rivals, chaos. The streets without Supreme were not quieter. They were louder, messier, deadlier. And as South Jamaica adjusted to this new reality, a question lingered in the air. If Supreme ever returned, could he rebuild what had been lost? Or had the world already moved past him, leaving only his legend behind? For Kenneth McGriff, locked behind bars, the answer to that question would define the rest of his life. And for South Jamaica, the scars of the Supreme Team's reign would never fully fade. Because when a king falls, his kingdom doesn't vanish. It fractures. And those fractures cut everyone who steps too close. The gates clanged open, and for the first time in years, Kenneth McGriff stepped into the daylight as a free man. The mid-1990s had arrived, and the world outside prison walls looked different. The crack era that had once made him rich was burning out under the weight of harsher laws and community exhaustion. Hip-hop, the soundtrack of the streets, was no longer underground. It was everywhere. What Kenneth had left behind when he went in was chaos. What he returned to was a city reshaped, still dangerous, still bleeding, but alive with a new rhythm. For most men coming out of prison, release meant struggle, finding work, staying clean, staying alive. But Kenneth was not most men. He carried with him a name that still whispered power in South Jamaica, a reputation that had grown larger than life while he was inside. To some, he was still supreme, the man who once ruled the blocks with order and fear. To others, he was a cautionary tale, proof that no empire lasts. For Kenneth himself, release meant something else, a chance to reinvent. The streets had taken him to the top once, but they had also caged him, and prison had given him time to think. The drug game was changing, the law was harsher, and the spotlight was hotter. If he went back to hustling, he knew how it would end: death or life behind bars. He had already tasted one, and he wasn't ready for the other. So Kenneth looked toward something new, something that still carried the allure of power, money, and influence, but promised legitimacy. Entertainment. The timing was perfect. Hip-hop was exploding, breaking into mainstream culture with the same force that crack had once broken into neighborhoods. Rappers were the new street kings, their lyrics filled with stories of hustling, survival, ambition, and betrayal. The world Kenneth had lived in, the world of corners and crews, of discipline and violence, was now being broadcast through speakers across America. He saw an opening. He saw a way to take the credibility he had earned on the streets and turn it into currency in the music world. Music had always been tied to the streets, but in the 90s, that tie became a lifeline. Authenticity mattered. Rappers who could claim real connections to the underworld carried more weight. And Kenneth was authenticity personified. He didn't just rap about the game. He had lived it, built it, ruled it. His presence alone gave credibility to artists who wanted their words to carry the gravity of truth. So he began to move, carefully but deliberately, into entertainment. He connected with industry figures, formed partnerships, and dipped into the world of film and music production. He looked at stories from the streets, stories not unlike his own, and saw their potential on screen. He began pushing to bring those stories to life through independent films, exploring projects that blurred the line between art and reality. It was a clever move. On the surface, it was legitimate business, contracts, production budgets, scripts. But beneath it was the same strategy Kenneth had always used: control the narrative, control the image. Just as he had once projected wealth and power through cars and jewelry, he now projected legitimacy and influence through entertainment. The streets noticed. Rappers noticed. Even Hollywood noticed. But reinvention is never easy. The shadow of his past followed him everywhere. Law enforcement had not forgotten who he was. To them, Kenneth's move into entertainment looked suspicious, like a front for the same empire he had always run. Every deal he made, every project he touched, was scrutinized. Was it really about film, or was it about laundering money? Was it really about music, or was it about rebuilding the Supreme Team under the cover of business? The questions never stopped. For Kenneth, those suspicions were both a curse and a strange kind of validation. They showed just how powerful his reputation still was, even years after his fall. But they also made every step harder. Investors hesitated. Partners worried. The government watched closely. The very name that opened doors in the streets now closed them in the boardrooms. Still, he pushed forward. He appeared at industry events, his calm presence as magnetic as ever. He cultivated relationships with rising rap stars, men who had grown up hearing his name in whispers and now saw him as living legend. He offered advice, shared war stories, and in doing so, embedded himself into the very culture that was shaping the 90s. For these rappers, Supreme was not just a man. He was proof that the streets and the music were connected, that one gave birth to the other. But even as he tried to reinvent himself, the pull of the past was relentless. Old associates reached out, old grudges lingered, and the money, as always, was a temptation. The entertainment business was glamorous, but it was also slow, unstable, and unpredictable. The streets had never been slow. They had been immediate, brutal, rewarding. To walk away from that completely required more discipline than most men possessed. Kenneth's reinvention carried another weight, too. The community he returned to was still scarred by what the Supreme Team had done. Families were still healing, addicts were still suffering, and the violence had left wounds that hadn't closed. For some, seeing him walk free and stepping into legitimate business felt like betrayal. How could a man who had poisoned the neighborhood now profit from telling its story? How could he shift from kingpin to producer without paying for the damage he had caused? Yet others admired him for it. They saw his pivot as proof that escape was possible, that reinvention was real. If Supreme could turn his back on the game and move into films and music, maybe they could too. Maybe the streets weren't the only way forward. The contradiction that had always defined Kenneth, villain and hero, feared and respected, followed him into this new chapter as well. And through it all, he stayed composed. The calm boy who once watched older hustlers from stoops was now a man watching the world change around him, adapting once again, calculating his moves. He knew reinvention wasn't guaranteed. He knew the past had claws. But he also knew he had survived too much to stop now. The mid-90s were a fragile moment for Kenneth. He was free, he was building something new, but the balance was delicate. One misstep, one bad decision, could drag him back into the abyss. He walked that line carefully, every step forward shadowed by the question he could never quite escape. Could Supreme truly leave the streets behind? Or would the streets, as they always did, come back to claim him? The lights of the music video set burned brighter than any corner street lamp. Cameras rolled, directors barked orders, and rappers draped in designer clothes performed verses that spoke of survival, loyalty, betrayal, and ambition. Behind the scenes, though, another figure stood watching, calm and collected, just as he always had been. Kenneth McGriff, Supreme, was no longer directing soldiers on the blocks of South Jamaica. Now he was directing money into an industry that fed on the very life he had once lived. The connection between the streets and hip-hop was never subtle. From the very beginning, rap was the language of the block. It was poetry carved out of poverty, beats stitched together from struggle, verses sharpened by the hunger of men and women who lived on the edge. And authenticity was everything. Listeners could smell a fake from a mile away. To survive in the rap game, you needed stories that rang true, or ties to people whose lives embodied them. Kenneth was one of those people. His name carried weight. His story was real. And in the 90s, that reality was worth gold. Kenneth gravitated toward Irv Gotti, a young, ambitious producer who was building his own empire in the music industry. Gotti's label, Murder Incorporated, was rising fast, fueled by talent, raw energy, and a vision of blending street credibility with chart-topping hits. To Gotti, having Kenneth in his orbit wasn't just an honor, it was validation. To the outside world, it looked like he was rubbing shoulders with a man who had survived the very streets rappers immortalized in their lyrics. To Kenneth, it was opportunity, a chance to plant himself firmly in an industry where power didn't have to end in bullets and prison bars. Money was the bridge. Music videos and independent films needed funding, and Kenneth had the resources. He invested in projects, helping bankroll visuals that captured the gritty essence of street life with cinematic flair. These weren't just art pieces, they were extensions of his legend. When rappers performed in videos funded by Supreme, the imagery felt authentic because it was touched by someone who had lived the life they rapped about. It blurred the line between entertainment and reality, pulling audiences deeper into the myth of the streets. The collaboration with Murder Incorporated was electric. The label already had stars rising, artists whose voices dominated radio waves, whose songs became anthems of the 90s and early 2000s. With Kenneth's presence behind the scenes, the aura grew heavier. To fans, Murder Incorporated wasn't just a label. It was a family with street ties, a brand that felt dangerous, real, untouchable. And Kenneth was part of that image. But with authenticity came suspicion. Law enforcement had never stopped watching him. To them, the connection between a former kingpin and a rising record label wasn't a coincidence. They saw Kenneth's investments not as legitimate business, but as money laundering. Every check he wrote, every dollar he moved into production, looked like a way to wash street money clean. Investigators circled, noting every connection, every public appearance, every whisper of his involvement. Still, Kenneth pressed on. He was determined to reinvent himself, and the rap game gave him the perfect stage. He wasn't rapping, but he didn't need to. His name was in the lyrics of others, referenced in verses, admired by artists who saw him as a symbol of everything their music represented. He was like a living ghost haunting the culture, never fully visible, but always felt. For the community, the sight of Supreme moving in the entertainment world carried mixed emotions. Some admired him, seeing his pivot as proof that even someone so deep in the game could change lanes. Others saw danger, worried that his presence in hip-hop was just another way to glorify the very streets that had scarred South Jamaica. Parents who had lost children to addiction or violence looked at his name, tied to music videos, and shook their heads, wondering how the man who had brought destruction could now profit from telling its story. But hip-hop wasn't built on comfort. It was built on pain, on contradictions, on the raw truth of life in neighborhoods like South Jamaica. And Kenneth embodied that contradiction perfectly. He was the man who had poisoned his community and also the man who had given back. He was feared and admired, hated and respected. He was the paradox that made hip-hop real. The Murder Incorporated connection only tightened. Kenneth's calm presence and financial backing gave the label an edge, a confidence that bled into its projects, but also brought heat. Federal agents expanded their investigations, looking not just at Kenneth, but at his associates in the music world. The entertainment industry became a new battlefield, with law enforcement convinced that behind the glitz and glamour, old hustles were still at play. Kenneth, though, knew how to move in shadows. He had spent a lifetime learning how to balance visibility with secrecy. He appeared when he wanted to, spoke when it mattered, but never overplayed his hand. To some, he was the quiet mentor, the legend guiding a new generation of hustlers turned artists. To others, he was the same Supreme as always, only dressed in a different suit. The truth, as always with Kenneth, was somewhere in the middle. He genuinely wanted to build something legitimate, to use his story and his resources to create art, music, film. But the streets never let go. His name was too heavy, his past too sharp. Every move he made carried echoes of what he had once been. And in the world of hip-hop, those echoes weren't just background noise. They were part of the music itself. By the late 90s, Kenneth McGriff had successfully tied himself to one of the hottest labels in the country. Murder Incorporated was topping charts, shaping culture, dominating airwaves. And Supreme was there, in the shadows, his influence undeniable. It looked like Reinvention was working, like the kingpin had finally found a way to bridge the streets and the spotlight without falling back into the same traps. But the same thing that made him valuable to hip-hop, the authenticity of his past, was also the very thing that threatened to destroy him again. The more visible he became, the more dangerous the attention grew. Law enforcement was circling closer. Rivals in the industry whispered about his influence. And even within the community, questions lingered. Was Supreme truly reinvented? Or was the rap game just another hustle in disguise? As cameras rolled on another music video, as Murder Incorporated climbed higher, as Kenneth's presence cemented itself in the culture, the shadow of his past grew longer. He was building something new, yes, but the old world hadn't gone anywhere. It was waiting, watching, ready to pull him back. And the next chapter of Kenneth McGriff's story would prove just how dangerous it can be when the streets and the spotlight collide. The camera zoomed in on the rapper's face, sweat glistening under stage lights, his voice tearing through the beat with words that painted images of the block, guns tucked in waistbands, dice rolling on cracked concrete, stacks of bills folded tight in rubber bands. The crowd roared because they believed it, not because they thought he could rap, but because they thought he was real. And in that moment, in every lyric that bled authenticity, there was a shadow behind him, a shadow shaped like Kenneth McGriff, Supreme, the man whose life blurred the line between hustler and rapper until you couldn't always tell where the music ended and the street began. By the mid-90s and into the early 2000s, hip-hop had fully merged with the imagery of the underworld. Chains, cars, women, crews, every music video was a mirror of the hustle. But it wasn't enough to just rap about it. Authenticity was the new currency. Fans wanted proof. They wanted to know that the words came from lived experience, not fantasy. That's where men like Supreme became more than just figures of the past. They became symbols, icons of the life rappers claimed, validators of an entire culture. Kenneth had built his empire on discipline and organization, but what survived after his fall was the legend. To rappers, his name was shorthand for credibility. It meant you weren't just spitting lines. You were speaking truth, backed by the aura of someone who had truly walked through fire. When Supreme was around, a rapper's words carried weight. He was the silent cosign, the ghost that turned performance into reality. The street rap nexus was not just about music. It was about identity. Rappers adopted the aesthetics of hustlers, the way they dressed, the way they moved, the way they talked about loyalty and betrayal. Hustlers, in turn, adopted the flair of rappers, understanding that image was as important as money. The two worlds fed each other, creating a loop where art and crime mirrored one another so closely that they became inseparable. And Kenneth stood at the center of that loop, living proof of the bridge between them. To fans, it looked glamorous. But behind the glamour was the same rawness Kenneth had always known. The rap industry wasn't just about beats and rhymes. It was about survival, territory, money, and betrayal. The same codes that ruled the block, respect, loyalty, fear, ruled the studios and stages. When a rapper shouted out Supreme, it wasn't just a lyric. It was a declaration, a signal that their music came from a place deeper than rhymes on a page. Kenneth's presence amplified it. He didn't have to say much. His calm demeanor, his quiet authority, his history, all of it wrapped around the culture like smoke. He attended shows, appeared in studios, moved in circles where his name was already legend. To rappers, being seen with Supreme was a badge of honor. To fans, it blurred the line between fiction and reality. And to law enforcement, it was proof that the streets had simply found a new disguise. The aesthetics of street rap, luxury cars, designer clothes, crews standing shoulder to shoulder, were reflections of the same visuals Kenneth had perfected years earlier with the Supreme team. The block had always been about appearance, about projecting power. Hip-hop just turned it into performance art, broadcasting it to millions instead of dozens. Supreme was the blueprint, the silent architect of a style that rappers elevated into global culture. But authenticity carries danger. Just as hustlers lived under constant threat of betrayal and violence, rappers who tied themselves too closely to the streets risked the same fate. Lyrics became confessions. Music videos looked like surveillance tapes, and the line between entertainment and evidence blurred. Kenneth embodied that risk. To some, he was a mentor. To others, a liability. His presence validated careers, but it also drew the eye of federal agents who were already convinced that the rap industry was more than just music. Fans, though, didn't care about law enforcement. They cared about the story. And Kenneth was the story, his rise, his fall, his survival, his reinvention. He was the living embodiment of the narrative rap had been telling for years. A young man born into poverty, forged in violence, who rose to power against all odds. That story resonated across neighborhoods, across cities, across oceans. And every time his name was mentioned in a song, the myth grew larger. For Kenneth, it must have felt like a strange kind of immortality. He was no longer running corners, no longer commanding soldiers. But his legend lived on in a different way, amplified through microphones and cameras. The empire of the streets had crumbled, but in its place, another empire, a cultural one, was being built, and he was part of its foundation. Still, myths come with shadows. The same qualities that made him iconic made him suspect. Law enforcement wasn't blind to the way his name floated through the industry. They saw rappers referencing him, producers working with him, money moving in ways that looked too familiar. To them, it wasn't art. It was evidence. They believed Kenneth hadn't left the game at all, that he was simply using music as a new front. And as their investigations deepened, the nexus between the streets and rap became more than cultural. It became criminal in their eyes. The tension was palpable. In studios, men laughed and celebrated, but in the back of their minds, they knew eyes were watching. Every lyric could be read as testimony. Every association could be painted as conspiracy. And Kenneth, calm as ever, walked through it all, knowing that reinvention was never clean, that the past had claws. The blurred line between hustler and rapper was more than aesthetic. It was survival strategy. Hustlers needed legitimacy. Rappers needed credibility. Together, they built something powerful, something magnetic. But magnets don't just attract. They also pull enemies closer. Kenneth had built his life on control, but in this new world, control was harder to maintain. The industry was larger, louder, messier than the streets had ever been, and the risks were magnified. Yet he couldn't step back. The culture needed him as much as he needed it. He was proof of the story, the anchor that made the music real. Without figures like Supreme, rap risked losing its authenticity, becoming just another genre instead of a movement. With him, it remained tied to its roots, to the raw truth of the block. And for Kenneth, being that symbol gave him purpose, even as it painted a bigger target on his back. By the early 2000s, the street rap nexus had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just lyrics, it was lifestyle, it was business, it was politics. And Kenneth was at the heart of it, a man whose presence shaped the very definition of authenticity. But authenticity comes at a cost. The more rappers leaned on his name, the more dangerous his position became. The legend was powerful, but legends are fragile too. The streets and the studio had merged, and Kenneth McGriff was the bridge that connected them. But bridges don't just connect, they also carry weight. And sooner or later, every bridge risks collapsing under the pressure. As the music got louder, as the spotlight grew hotter, as his name echoed across airwaves, one question hung over him like a storm cloud. Was Kenneth Supreme McGriff truly free from the streets? Or was the rap game just another empire waiting to collapse around him? The gunfire erupted in Queens one night in May of 2000, 9 bullets tearing through the air, shattering glass, and nearly ending the life of a rapper who hadn't even released his first album. He was young, hungry, and fearless, A man whose music pulled no punches when it came to calling out names, exposing stories, and questioning reputations. His stage name was 50 Cent, and in the shadows of that violence, one name whispered louder than the rest: Kenneth "Supreme" McGriff. The feud between Supreme and 50 Cent wasn't just about music. It was personal. It was history bleeding into melody, the streets colliding with the studio in a way that blurred the line between art and war. At its root was something simple but dangerous: truth. 50 Cent was making songs that didn't just entertain. They accused. They mocked. They exposed. And in a world where reputation was everything, words could be as deadly as bullets. It started with a track, one that never even made it to a proper release but spread through mixtapes and whispers across New York. 50 Cent recorded a song called Ghetto Churan. In it, he laid out names, events, hustlers, and legends of South Jamaica. He didn't just rap about the streets, he documented them, bar for bar, with a sharpness that cut deep. And one of the names woven into those lyrics was Supreme. To the average listener, it sounded like a gritty street tale, maybe even history. But to those who had lived it, it felt like exposure. Secrets weren't supposed to leave the block. Codes weren't supposed to be broken. And for a man like Kenneth McGriff, who had spent his life building a reputation on silence, discipline, and myth, being name-dropped by a rising rapper was a problem too big to ignore. The tension simmered, fed by more than just lyrics. 50 Cent had his own street ties, his own history, and his own enemies. He wasn't afraid to poke at figures others avoided. That fearlessness made him magnetic to fans, but dangerous to those who valued silence. As his buzz grew, so did the whispers. The streets said Supreme wasn't pleased. They said conversations were happening behind closed doors, that threats were being made, that the young rapper had painted a target on his back. Then came the shooting. 9 bullets, 1 man, and a storm of speculation. 50 Cent survived, but the streets lit up with questions. Who ordered it? Who pulled the trigger? Was it revenge for the song, a message to stay quiet, or just the natural fallout of a man making too many enemies too quickly? The answers were never clear. The rumors, though, always circled back to Supreme. In the aftermath, the feud transformed. It wasn't just about the streets anymore. It was about the industry. Murder Incorporated, the label Supreme was tied to, stood on one side, with stars like Ja Rule dominating the charts. On the other side stood 50 Cent, rising under the wing of Eminem and Dr. Dre, ready to flip the industry upside down. What started as a street-level grudge exploded into one of the biggest rivalries in hip-hop history. Diss tracks flew back and forth. 50 Cent mocked Ja Rule, mocked Murder Incorporated, mocked anyone connected to Supreme. He painted them as soft, fake, unworthy of the credibility they claimed. His words were venom, his tone ruthless, and because of his brush with death, every lyric carried extra weight. Fans believed him. They believed his survival gave him the right to say whatever he wanted. On the other side, Ja Rule and Murder Incorporated fought back. They released their own tracks, their own responses, their own attempts to tear down 50 Cent's rising legend. Supreme, though less visible, was always present in the shadows of the feud. His history with the streets, his reputation for discipline and power, gave Murder Incorporated an aura of authenticity. To 50 Cent, that was exactly the problem. He wasn't just battling rappers. He was battling a ghost from South Jamaica, whose influence reached far beyond the microphone. The violence didn't stay in the music. Brawls broke out. Studios became battlegrounds. Threats turned into fights, and fights sometimes turned into blood. For fans, it was thrilling drama, an endless war played out on radio waves and magazine covers. For those inside it, it was survival. Every verse, every move carried risk. The feud blurred the line between rap beef and real beef until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. For Supreme, watching it all unfold must have been surreal. He had once ruled the streets with iron discipline, his every decision shaping the lives of those around him. Now his name was being screamed in songs, splashed across headlines, debated in barbershops and clubs. He had become more than a man. He was a symbol, but symbols are double-edged. They inspire, but they also attract fire. And 50 Cent wasn't afraid to aim straight at him. The federal government, already suspicious of Supreme's ties to Murder Incorporated, watched the feud closely. To them, it looked like evidence, another thread in a web connecting crime, music, and money. Every threat, every fight, every shooting became part of their narrative. They saw the feud not as entertainment, but as proof that the street rap nexus was criminal at its core. And yet, for all the danger, the feud propelled both sides to greater heights. 50 Cent's survival, his relentless attacks, his refusal to back down, it all made him a superstar. Murder Incorporated, though battered, remained a force, with its stars still dominating charts for a time. And Supreme, though not rapping a single bar, became one of the most infamous names in hip-hop by proxy. His life had once been whispered only on blocks in Queens. Now it was broadcast across the globe. But fame built on fire never lasts. The more the feud escalated, the closer the collapse loomed. The music industry loved the spectacle, but law enforcement loved it too, for a different reason. Every public feud gave them ammunition. Every lyric more justification to dig deeper, to tie Kenneth McGriff not just to music, but to conspiracy. And as the feud burned hotter, one truth became undeniable. Kenneth Supreme McGriff had become the very embodiment of the blurred line between the streets and the studio. He was no longer just a kingpin, no longer just a businessman trying to reinvent. He was the ghost in the machine, haunting the culture, shaping its battles, and living through its wars. But ghosts don't always stay in shadows. And as federal eyes closed in, as the feud turned darker, as the music spilled deeper into violence, a storm was building that would soon engulf everyone involved. Because battles fought in songs can end in courtrooms. And Supreme was about to find that out. The quiet of a Queens afternoon was shattered by the stutter of gunfire. Neighbors froze, children screamed, and a young rapper's body hit the pavement. He had just slid into the back seat of a car outside his grandmother's house when the bullets rained down. 1, 2, 3. By the time the smoke cleared, 9 slugs had torn through him. 9 chances for death. 9 scars he would carry forever. Against all odds, he survived. His name was 50 Cent, and the whispers began almost immediately. Who had wanted him gone? And why did so many of those whispers trace back to one man, Kenneth Supreme McGriff? The shooting in May of 2000 wasn't just another headline in New York. It was an earthquake. 50 Cent was no superstar yet, but he was a rising force, a rapper whose mixtapes buzzed across the city, whose name was climbing from block to block. And part of his appeal came from his fearlessness. He didn't just rap about the streets, he named them. His song Ghetto Chiran had been like an oral history of South Jamaica, laying out names, stories, legends of the underworld with shocking clarity. It was art to some, but to others, it was exposure. And exposure is deadly. In the streets, information is currency. To give it away freely, even in rhyme, is to break a code older than hip-hop itself. 50's lyrics drew admiration from fans, but to men who had lived those stories, it felt like betrayal. And the most dangerous name in that song was Supreme. The same man who had once ruled Queens with discipline, who had turned the Supreme Team into a symbol of order and fear, was now immortalized in rhyme. To some, it was respect. To others, it was a threat to the very code that had kept them alive. When the bullets hit 50 Cent, speculation was immediate. People connected the dots between the song, the history, and the man whose name still carried weight. The streets whispered that Supreme had ordered it, a warning shot to anyone who dared put his story into the public. Others dismissed it as paranoia, saying the young rapper had made too many enemies, that anyone with a grudge could have pulled the trigger. But in South Jamaica, where reputation mattered as much as fact, the whispers grew louder than the truth. 50 Cent's survival only made the story bigger. He spent 13 days in the hospital, jaw wired shut, body stitched back together. Most men wouldn't have walked away from 9 bullets. He did. And when he returned, scarred but alive, he carried with him not just the weight of his survival, but the legend of it. His music gained a new edge, his image hardened, his credibility cemented. Fans saw him as untouchable, chosen, a man who had stared death in the face and walked away. In a culture that prized authenticity, nothing was more authentic than survival. But survival carried consequences. For 50, the shooting changed everything. He became more cautious, but also more determined. His lyrics grew sharper, his dices bolder. He turned his survival into fuel, building a persona that was bigger, louder, more dangerous than before. And behind it all, the shadow of Supreme lingered. Whether he was involved or not, the perception tied him to the act, weaving his name into the mythology of 50 Cent's rise. For Supreme, the speculation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it reinforced his legend. Even from the shadows, even without proof, his name carried fear. To be suspected of orchestrating such an attack showed that his influence was still real. On the other hand, it painted a target on his back. Law enforcement, already watching his ties to the music industry, now had another reason to connect him to violence. The whispers became part of their case, evidence not in fact but in perception. The impact on hip-hop was seismic. The shooting didn't just scar one rapper. It reshaped the balance of power in the industry. On one side was Murder Incorporated, the label Supreme was tied to, with Ja Rule dominating radio and charts. On the other side was 50 Cent, now rising faster than ever, aligned with Eminem and Dr. Dre, ready to challenge the throne. What had started as a feud of words became a war with casualties. The shooting was the line in the sand, the moment where music stopped being just entertainment and became survival. The culture fed on it. Fans dissected every lyric, every rumor, every piece of gossip. Magazines ran stories connecting dots, building narratives that blurred truth and fiction. For the audience, it was theater, dangerous, thrilling, intoxicating. For the men living it, it was life and death. Each song carried risk. Each appearance in public was a gamble. And the question of who had fired those 9 bullets remained an open wound. 50 himself leaned into the mystery. He never denied his suspicions. He never stopped poking at Supreme, at Ja Rule, at Murder Incorporated. His words became weapons, and each one added fuel to the fire. His rise to stardom was tied directly to the image of a man who had survived what should have killed him. And Supreme's name was etched into that story, whether he wanted it or not. The shooting also deepened law enforcement's obsession with the street rap nexus. To them, it was proof that the industry wasn't just tied to crime. It was crime dressed in beats and lyrics. They saw the feud as evidence, the violence as validation. And Supreme, already under their microscope, became the prime symbol of everything they wanted to dismantle. But the truth of that afternoon in May remained slippery. No one was ever convicted for the shooting. No one stood trial. The whispers stayed whispers, passed from mouth to mouth, from block to block, until they became legend. In the absence of fact, perception ruled. And in perception, Supreme was guilty in the court of the streets. For Kenneth, that was both power and poison. Power because his name remained untouchable, feared, larger than life. Poison because the more his name was tied to violence, the harder it became to escape his past, to reinvent, to be seen as anything other than what he had always been. The entertainment empire he was trying to build now looked, to outsiders, like nothing more than a mask for old crimes. And for 50, the shooting became the cornerstone of his career. It gave him a story no other rapper could claim, a legend no diss track could erase. Every time he stepped on stage, every time he spat a verse, fans remembered the bullets, the survival, the scars. He turned pain into power, and Supreme's name lingered in the background like a ghost. The shooting of 50 Cent wasn't just a moment of violence. It was a turning point. It marked the collision of two worlds, streets and studio, in a way that neither could untangle. It fueled careers, destroyed alliances, and set the stage for years of conflict. And through it all, The question remained unanswered. Was Supreme truly behind it? Or had his legend become so heavy that he was doomed to carry blame for every shadow that fell in Queens? The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. And in that silence, one thing was clear: the storm was only beginning. Inside the industry, fear rippled. Other labels watched carefully, wondering if they would be next. Artists wondered if their careers would survive the fallout. Murder Incorporated's dominance began to crack. Radio stations hesitated. Distribution partners grew nervous. And in the middle of it all was Supreme, the man whose legend had once made the label seem untouchable, now threatening to pull it into ruin. The irony was brutal. Supreme had moved into entertainment to escape the cycle of the streets, to reinvent himself in a world where money and power didn't end in prison bars. But by tying himself to Murder Incorporated, by carrying his reputation into the industry, he had brought the cycle with him. The very thing that made him valuable, his authenticity, his credibility, his legend, was the same thing that made him dangerous. For the government, the case was about more than Kenneth McGriff. It was about sending a message. Hip-hop had become a global force, but it was also under scrutiny. Politicians denounced its lyrics. Critics tied it to crime. By targeting Murder Incorporated, prosecutors weren't just going after one label. They were making a statement to the entire industry. The line between art and crime could not be blurred without consequence. The accusations hit hard. Murder Incorporated was portrayed as a front, a glittering facade covering the same old hustles. Supreme was painted as the puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes, using music as his new empire. Whether it was true or not almost didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, perception was reality, and the perception was damning. For Kenneth, the heat was unbearable. He had tried to step into legitimacy, but legitimacy was fragile. One accusation could tear it apart. And now the accusations weren't whispers. They were shouted from headlines, debated on television, dissected in court. The same man who had once built an empire out of discipline now watched as another empire, built from music, from art, from reinvention, teetered on collapse because of his shadow. The investigation dragged on, grinding through years of legal battles, financial audits, and public scrutiny. Murder Incorporated fought to survive, to keep releasing music, to keep their artists relevant. But the weight of the federal spotlight was crushing. Partnerships dissolved. Careers stalled. The label that had once dominated charts began to fade. And all of it circled back to the presence of one man. Kenneth McGriff had become the ghost in the machine once again, a figure whose legend fueled success, but whose reality invited destruction. To the streets, his name still carried respect. To hip-hop, he was both myth and menace. To the government, he was proof that crime could wear a new mask but never truly disappear. The story of Murder Incorporated under fire wasn't just about music or money. It was about the impossibility of escaping the past. Kenneth had tried to reinvent himself, to turn his legend into legitimacy. But in the end, the legend was too heavy. It weighed down everything it touched. And as federal agents pushed deeper, as the pressure mounted, as the walls closed in once more, a question hung heavy in the air. Would Supreme survive this storm the way he had survived all the others? Or was this the one that would finally break him? The morning sunlight bounced off glass towers in Manhattan as agents in dark suits filed into offices with boxes, folders, and warrants. On the surface, it looked like any other federal operation. Calculations, paperwork, quiet efficiency. But this wasn't about a bank or a corporation. This was about music. Murder Incorporated Records, one of the hottest labels in the country, was suddenly under fire. And behind the headlines, behind the tension, was a familiar shadow: Kenneth Supreme McGriff. The investigation had been building quietly for years. Federal agents weren't blind to the rumors, the whispers, the legends tying Supreme to Murder Incorporated. They had watched as he moved out of prison and into the entertainment world, as he invested in films, financed music videos, and stood close to one of the most powerful labels in hip-hop. To the public, it looked like Reinvention, a kingpin turning legitimate. To prosecutors, it looked like something else entirely: laundering. Money laundering sounds complicated, but at its core it's simple. It's taking dirty money, cash from illegal businesses like drugs, and moving it through legitimate businesses until it looks clean. Think of it like washing clothes. The dirt is still there, but once it's been spun through the machine, it looks fresh. To law enforcement, Murder Incorporated was the washing machine. And Supreme's presence, his investments, his name tied to the label, made the suspicion unavoidable. The agents began piecing it together. They combed through financial records, looking for inconsistencies. They traced checks, compared deposits, analyzed budgets for films that never seemed to finish and videos that cost far more than they should. To them, every dollar looked suspicious. Every studio session, every flashy party, every new car bought by someone tied to the label could be evidence of dirty money moving through clean channels. And then there was the feud. The bitter war between 50 Cent and Murder Incorporated wasn't just tabloid drama to investigators. It was a window. To them, the violence surrounding the feud was proof that the streets and the studio weren't separate at all. They were one and the same. And if Murder Incorporated was fueled by street money, then Supreme was the gasoline. The raids came suddenly. Federal agents stormed Murder Incorporated's offices, seizing computers, hard drives, boxes of files. Headlines exploded. Fans were shocked. This was the label that had given them chart-topping hits, the soundtrack of their nights out, their car rides, their heartbreaks. Now was being accused of being more than music, a criminal enterprise dressed in beats and rhymes. For Irv Gotti, the label's founder, the accusations were devastating. He insisted it was music, nothing more. He claimed the feds were targeting them because they were black, because they were successful, because hip-hop itself was feared by institutions that didn't understand it. He said Supreme's presence was about friendship, mentorship, support, not crime. But the headlines didn't care about explanations. They cared about the story. And the story was that Murder Incorporated was under investigation for laundering drug money for one of the most notorious kingpins Queens had ever seen. For Supreme, it was a familiar feeling. The walls closing in, the whispers turning into evidence, the government circling with patience and precision. He had lived it before with the Supreme team. Now he was living it again, this time with music. No matter how legitimate he tried to be, his past followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. To law enforcement, once a hustler meant always a hustler. And Kenneth McGriff would never be free of that label. The pressure grew. The media feasted on the story, spinning tales of gangsters funding record labels, of rappers tied to cartels, of songs that weren't just lyrics but confessions. Fans debated in barbershops and corners, some defending Murder Incorporated as victims of government overreach, others convinced the feds were right. The narrative of the street rap nexus that Supreme embodied became bigger than ever. The cameras were rolling, actors were on set, and the script pages flipped under hot studio lights. It looked like any other low-budget crime film being put together in the early 2000s. Gritty dialogue, flashy cars, stories of hustlers chasing money and power. But this wasn't just another movie. Behind the scenes, the man bankrolling the project was Kenneth Supreme McGriff. And for federal agents already circling him, this wasn't Hollywood magic. This was evidence. The film was called Crime Partners, based on a novel by a black crime writer whose stories mirrored the harsh realities of the streets. It told the tale of loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of the game. For Kenneth, the story hit close to home. It wasn't just fiction, it was reflection, and producing it gave him something he had been craving since leaving prison: legitimacy. He wasn't trying to run corners anymore. He was trying to run credits. His name in film wasn't just about art. It was about transformation. The decision to fund Crime Partners made sense. Hip-hop was already crossing into Hollywood, with rappers starring in movies, producing soundtracks, and building brands that stretched far beyond music. Kenneth saw an opening. If he could carve out a place in film, he could tell stories that mattered to him, stories that carried the weight of authenticity. And maybe, just maybe, he could prove that he wasn't trapped by his past. But to federal authorities, the movie was a red flag waving in plain sight. They didn't see a man try and change. They saw a man using film as a front. Movies cost money, big money. And when investigators looked at the budget, when they traced the checks, when they saw Supreme's name tied to the production, alarms went off. Where is this money coming from? Was it clean? Or was this just another laundering machine dressed up as art? For Kenneth, the irony was crushing. He had stepped into film to escape the narrative of the streets, but the narrative followed him anyway. Every dollar he invested was seen as dirty. Every connection he made was scrutinized. To the government, his past erased the possibility of innocence. They didn't believe he could ever be legitimate. And so the film, instead of being a symbol of reinvention, became a weapon used against him. On set, though, none of that mattered. The cast included rappers, street figures, people who knew the world being portrayed because they had lived it. The atmosphere buzzed with authenticity. When actors delivered lines about loyalty and betrayal, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like testimony. And Kenneth, calm as always, stood behind the scenes, watching it all unfold. He wasn't a hustler here. He was a producer, a storyteller, a man finally in control of the narrative rather than being its prisoner. But the cameras weren't just in Hollywood. They were in government offices too. Federal agents tracked the production, gathering files, noting names, watching who came and went. To them, Crime Partners wasn't just a movie. It was a case study, a trail of evidence that tied Kenneth McGriff to money, to artists, to the same world they were determined to prove was criminal at its core. The press got hold of the story. Headlines painted Supreme as the gangster who had gone Hollywood, the kingpin turned movie producer. Some celebrated it, seeing it as redemption. Others mocked it, saying he was glamorizing the very life that had destroyed so many. The contradiction that had always defined him, villain and hero, feared and admired, was now playing out on a bigger stage. And the film itself became part of that contradiction. For fans, it was art imitating life, raw and real. For critics, it was dangerous, a glorification of crime packaged as entertainment. For law enforcement, it was something darker, a signal that Supreme was still in the game, only smarter now, using Hollywood as his new corner. The success of Crime Partners was modest, but its impact was massive. It proved that Kenneth could move in the entertainment world, that his story and his influence had weight beyond the block. But it also deepened the spotlight on him. Every premiere, every interview, every mention of his name tied him tighter to federal suspicions. Reinvention had turned into entanglement. For Kenneth personally, the project must have been bittersweet. On one hand, he had done what few from his world had ever managed. Crossed from the streets in a film, created something lasting, something legitimate. On the other hand, he couldn't escape the truth that the past was always present. The same legend that made his film feel real was the same legend that made him guilty in the eyes of the government. Behind the scenes, prosecutors dug deeper. They believed Crime Partners was part of a larger puzzle. To them, it wasn't just about a single movie. It was about showing a pattern, music videos, record labels, films, all of it tied to Supreme, all of it potentially fueled by dirty money. The film wasn't proof in itself, but it was another brick in the wall they were building around him. The people around Kenneth felt the pressure too. Artists, producers, even friends worried that being close to him meant being dragged into investigations, into trials, into headlines. Some stood by him, loyal to the man they respected. Others pulled back, fearful of the heat. The duality that had always followed him spread again. Some saw him as an inspiration, others as a liability. And for the hip-hop world, the film's story and Kenneth's presence only deepened the myth of the street rap nexus. Here was a man who had once ruled the streets, now funding art about those very streets, surrounded by rappers who sang his praises. It blurred the line further, making the streets and the studio indistinguishable. To fans, it was thrilling. To law enforcement, it was incriminating. The attempt to Hollywood showed the best and worst of Kenneth McGriff's reinvention. It was proof that he could pivot, that his legend could carry into new worlds. But it was also proof that the past cannot be washed away with credits and cameras. The story of Supreme was too heavy, too tangled in crime and myth, to ever be told without suspicion. The film wrapped, the credits rolled, and for a moment Kenneth stood at the edge of something new. But behind him, the storm clouds gathered. The feds weren't done. The case wasn't closed. The cameras had stopped rolling in Hollywood, but they were still rolling in courtrooms, in offices, in secret investigations that traced his every move. The lights of the set dimmed, the applause faded, and the question hung in the air like smoke. Could Supreme truly become a storyteller instead of story? Or was the next scene already being written by prosecutors determined to make sure his Hollywood dream turned into another nightmare? The room was dark, silent except for the faint hum of machines. A reel turned slowly, spooling hours of conversations caught in the air and trapped on tape. Agents leaned forward, headphones pressed to their ears, pens scratching across paper. Voices crackled, casual, coded, sometimes nothing more than laughter. But buried in the chatter were pieces of a puzzle. Words that hinted at money, at violence, at blood spilled in the shadows of Queens. This was how the government hunted Kenneth Supreme McGriff. Not with bullets or raids, but with patience, tape by tape, dollar by dollar, until the walls around him began to close. The feds had learned from the past. Taking down street crews with guns and drug raids had worked before, but Supreme wasn't running corners anymore. He was older, smarter, careful. To dismantle him now meant going deeper into the invisible currents of phone calls, bank transfers, and whispered conversations in backrooms. It meant building a case so tight that no jury could escape the weight of it. Wiretaps became their weapon. Phones clicked, lines hissed, and Supreme's circle began to shrink. Investigators listened to everything: calls about business, casual chats, even coded language that seemed meaningless until placed in context. To an outsider, a man saying he was dropping off a package might sound harmless. To an agent with months of recordings, it was evidence. A drop, a deal, another brick in the wall. Surveillance teams followed quietly. Cars with tinted windows parked for hours outside homes, engines off, radios low. Men with cameras trailed through neighborhoods, capturing photos of meetings, handshakes, envelopes sliding across tables. Supreme's calm presence was spotted at gatherings with men already suspected of murder. Men whispered about in connection to shootings that had rattled Queens. Each photograph was logged, time-stamped, added to files thicker than novels. Financial tracking added another layer. Money leaves trails, even when it tries to hide. Agents followed checks tied to film productions, traced deposits and accounts that didn't match reported income, flagged wire transfers that moved through strange hands before landing where they weren't supposed to. To prosecutors, the numbers painted a picture clearer than any surveillance photo. Drug money being washed clean, violence being funded, an empire still breathing even when its kingpin claimed reinvention. And then there were the whispers about murders. Men dead in alleys, bodies slumped in cars, rivals who had fallen silent without warning. None of it pointed directly at Supreme. He was too careful for that. But the connections formed like a spiderweb. Associates tied to him appeared again and again in investigations of killings. Wiretaps hinted at retaliation. Surveillance showed him meeting with figures just days before violence erupted. The government didn't need him pulling the trigger. They only needed to convince a jury that he had been the one pulling strings. The agents were patient, relentless. They had watched him rise before. They had watched him pivot into music, into Hollywood. And now, they were determined to prove that it was all smoke, that beneath the glitz and cameras was the same hustler from South Jamaica. They believe his reinvention was nothing more than camouflage. And with every tape, every photo, every bank slip, they sharpened their case. For Kenneth, the pressure must have felt familiar. He had lived under surveillance before, back in the days when the Supreme team ruled the blocks. But back then, it was easier to spot, cars circling too often, faces lingering too long. Now it was invisible, wires and numbers, technology digging into places no lookout could protect. The paranoia must have crept in, the sense that every call was being listened to, every step being followed. For a man who had built his life on discipline and control, that loss of privacy was its own kind of cage. The people around him felt it too. Friends who once answered calls casually now hesitated. Associates who once showed up for meetings now stayed away, fearing the eyes they couldn't see. Some began to cooperate with investigators, trading information for lighter sentences, betraying the very loyalty Supreme had demanded for years. Each betrayal was another crack in the armor, each informant another thread tied to his name. And yet, Supreme remained calm, at least on the surface. Those who knew him described him as steady, even under the weight of federal suspicion. He moved carefully, spoke less, kept his circle tight. But calm doesn't erase evidence. It doesn't stop reels from spinning in dark rooms, or agents from stitching together fragments into a story they could tell in court. The government's case was becoming more than suspicion. It was narrative, a story they would tell to a jury, of a man who had once poisoned his community with crack, who had gone to prison, who came out claiming reinvention, but never truly left the life behind. They would argue that the music videos, the films, the friendships were all covers. That behind the cameras, behind the lights, Supreme was still Supreme, funding crime, ordering murders, moving money. And the murder whispers were the heaviest of all. Among them was the killing of a rival drug figure, a man whose death had shocked Queens. Another link to an attempted hit that nearly killed a rapper whose feud with Murder Incorporated had shaken the industry. The evidence wasn't clean, wasn't direct, but prosecutors didn't need perfection. They needed patterns. They needed the web. And the web pointed back to Kenneth. For the hip-hop world, the investigation cast a long shadow. Artists who had once proudly name-dropped Supreme now grew quiet. The glamour of being tied to a legend dimmed under the weight of federal scrutiny. Every lyric, every association was suddenly risky, a thread that could be tugged in court. The line between art and crime had never been thinner. And Supreme was at the center, the symbol of both. To the community, it was déjà vu. They had watched him rise, watched him fall, watched him return. Now, they were watching the government move in again, patient and precise. Some hoped he would escape, prove the feds wrong, reinvent fully. Others whispered that the storm was inevitable, that no man could outrun his past forever. The streets had long memories, but the governments were longer. The reels kept spinning. The surveillance continued. The financial records stacked higher. And as the case grew, so did the sense of inevitability. Supreme had built empires before, and each time, the walls had closed in. Now, in the early 2000s, they were closing again, tighter than ever, with wiretaps, surveillance photos, and bank slips forming a cage more unbreakable than steel bars. And yet, even as the government prepared its case, one question lingered. Was Supreme truly guilty of what they claimed? Or had his legend become so heavy, so entangled in myth and fear, that he was doomed to be judged not by what he did, but by what people believed he had done? The tapes would speak. The photos would testify. The numbers would tell their story. But whether they told the truth, or simply the version of the truth the government wanted, remained uncertain. The stage was set for a trial that would not just decide the fate of Kenneth McGriff, but redefine the line between the streets, the studio, and the system itself. And as the feds circled closer, as the evidence mounted, as the whispers of murder grew louder, the calm face of Supreme masked a truth only he knew, whether he was still in control, or whether the game had finally caught up to him for good. The gunfire was quick, merciless, and loud enough to echo down the block long after the smoke cleared. Eric, E-Money Bags, Smith lay slumped, riddled with bullets, the kind of execution that screamed of planning rather than impulse. For neighbors, it was another terrifying night in Queens. For investigators, it was something else entirely, a potential link in a chain of violence that pointed straight to Kenneth Supreme McGriff. By the early 2000s, federal prosecutors weren't just interested in drugs or money. They were building a case that reached for something heavier: murder for hire. They claimed Supreme had stepped into a role far more chilling than financier or hustler. They alleged he had become the man who ordered death itself, paying others to pull triggers, eliminating rivals, and anyone he believed stood in the way. E-Money Bags wasn't just anyone. He was a figure in Queens' underworld, a hustler with a reputation for fearlessness, someone who moved in the same orbit as rappers and dealers, blurring the line between music and street legend. His killing in 2001 wasn't random. Prosecutors argued it was personal, that Supreme had ordered it in retaliation for a tangled web of slights and rivalries, a message written in gunpowder that his influence was still alive. And that was just one name. Others began to surface. Investigators tied Supreme to more killings, drug rivals gunned down, associates who had fallen out of favor, men who had once been close but ended up expendable. The stories were murky, built on whispers, informants, coded calls. But together, they painted a portrait of a man running a shadow campaign of violence, even as he claimed to be a reformed businessman in music and film. Murder for hire is one of the most serious charges in American law. It strips away the distance between ordering and doing, saying that paying for violence is no different than pulling the trigger yourself. To a jury, it doesn't matter if Supreme never touched a gun. If prosecutors could convince them that he gave the order, that money changed hands, that men acted on his command, then guilt was just as heavy. Wiretaps hinted at it. Surveillance suggested it. Informants swore to it. A chilling mosaic began to form. Agents described meetings in cars that ended with men later turning up dead. They replayed calls where vague phrases took on sinister meaning once paired with timelines. To ordinary ears, the words might have sounded harmless. To investigators, they were instructions. The government's story grew darker with each connection. They said Supreme wasn't just laundering money through record labels or films. He was laundering blood. Each killing wasn't random, but strategic. Another move on a chessboard he still controlled. Rivals fell. Associates silenced. And the streets whispered what the prosecutors tried to prove: that Supreme's calm presence hid a ruthless efficiency, a willingness to erase anyone who threatened his legend. For the defense, it was a nightmare. How do you fight whispers? How do you fight perception? They argued there was no direct proof, no gun in his hand, no clear recording of him ordering a hit. They said the government was stacking rumors, building a castle of shadows, trying to convict a man not on facts, but on fear of his name. But in court, perception often weighs as heavily as proof, and the legend of Supreme was heavy indeed. The community was divided. Some believed the accusations, pointing to the pattern of bodies, the way fear had ruled Queens for decades. Others saw it as government overreach, an attempt to destroy a man who had already served his time, who had tried to move legitimate, who was being judged forever by his past. In barbershops and on corners, debates raged. Was Supreme still orchestrating from the shadows, or was he being framed by the myth that bore his name? E-Money Bags became the centerpiece of the story. His murder was the headline, the symbol, the name prosecutors repeated. They painted it as proof that Supreme's hands were still dirty, that he couldn't leave the life behind. They said money had moved, that shooters had been paid, that loyalty had been bought with cash and bullets. And while the evidence was circumstantial, the weight of narrative was crushing. For Kenneth, the accusations must have felt like chains tightening again. He had fought for reinvention, stepped in entertainment, tried to build something new. But the past wasn't just following him. It was pulling him back, brick by brick, into a cage made of death and memory. Even if he denied the charges, even if he claimed innocence, the image of him as a man who could order a killing with a nod was too powerful to erase. The trial loomed, heavy with tension. Each day promised more tapes, more witnesses, more stories of men who had crossed Supreme and ended up gone. Prosecutors sharpened their arguments, weaving together drugs, money, music, and murder into a single tapestry. And the defense braced, knowing they weren't just fighting evidence, they were fighting legend. In the end, The murder-for-hire allegations became the heart of the case. They weren't just about bodies in Queens. They were about defining Kenneth McGriff forever. Was he a man who tried to reinvent? Or was he a man who could never stop pulling strings of violence? The jury would have to decide. But as the courtroom filled, as the tapes played, as names like E-Money Bags echoed through the halls of justice, one truth was clear. This wasn't just about crimes. It was about legacy. And the cliffhanger was brutal. Because for Supreme, the question wasn't just whether he would be convicted. It was whether his entire story, from the streets of South Jamaica to the lights of Hollywood, would be remembered as one long attempt at reinvention, or as the tale of a man who could never escape the pool of blood. The indictment read like a storybook of crime, page after page of names, dates, events, and charges, each one stacked carefully to form the picture the government wanted to tell. It was spring of 2003 when the announcement finally came. Kenneth Supreme McGriff, once the feared kingpin of South Jamaica, was now facing the full weight of the federal government under one of its most powerful weapons, RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO for short wasn't just another law. It was a net, designed in the 1970s to crush the mafia. It let prosecutors argue that someone wasn't just guilty of individual crimes, but of running an entire criminal enterprise. It meant every phone call, every transaction, every suspected murder or drug deal could be woven into one giant case. To the jury, it wouldn't matter if Kenneth pulled a trigger or touched a kilo. What mattered was that the government could argue he directed it, benefited from it, orchestrated it like a conductor leading an orchestra of crime. Federal prosecutors didn't hold back. They said Supreme wasn't just dipping into music and movies. He was laundering drug money through Murder Incorporated, ordering murders like E-Money Bags and other rivals, and running his operation like a corporation of violence. They tied his past and the Supreme team to his present in entertainment, saying it was all one continuous story, proof that he had never left the life behind. The indictment was sprawling, and the courtroom strategy was simple. Overwhelm the jury with a story so big, so interconnected, that no reasonable doubt could survive. The prosecutors leaned on years of surveillance, boxes of financial records, and above all, the voices of cooperating witnesses. Cooperating witnesses, snitches in the language of the streets, were the backbone of the government's case. They were men who had once stood beside Kenneth, men who had taken his money, worked his corners, shared in his victories. Now, facing long sentences of their own, they sat in federal custody and decided to talk. The government promised lighter time in exchange for truth, or at least a version of truth that prosecutors needed. When those men took the stand, the courtroom thickened with tension. Some spoke with bitterness, others with fear, a few with a kind of resigned calm. They described meetings, handshakes, coded words, cash changing hands. They painted pictures of Supreme not as a man who had left crime, but as a boss still in control, still feared, still calling shots. The defense tore at them, cross-examining each one, hammering on credibility. They argued these men were liars, desperate to save themselves, willing to say anything for a deal. They reminded the jury that many of these witnesses had their own histories of violence, their own murders, their own betrayals. Could such men be trusted to tell the truth? Or were they simply building stories to appease prosecutors? But the power of RICO wasn't in a single voice. It was in the accumulation. One witness could be doubted. Two could be questioned. But when 3, 4, 5 people began telling pieces of the same story, the pattern began to emerge. And prosecutors knew that juries believe patterns. They believe the sense that smoke must mean fire. The courtroom became a theater. Prosecutors played wiretap recordings where jurors leaned forward, straining to catch words that slipped through static. They displayed photographs of Kenneth with known associates, framing them as conspiratorial meetings instead of casual encounters. They walked through bank records slowly, line by line, showing how money moved in ways they argued no legitimate business could explain. Each day added another piece. Each day, The net tightened. And through it all, Kenneth sat calm, his expression steady, his posture measured. For years he had been a figure larger than life, a man whose name echoed in songs, in streets, in headlines. Now he was reduced to a suit in a courtroom, watching his story be told by others. Some said he looked unfazed, confident that the government could not truly prove its case. Others believed he was simply disciplined, unwilling to give prosecutors the satisfaction of seeing him break. But behind that calm, the stakes were crushing. RICO carried sentences that weren't measured in years, but in lifetimes. A guilty verdict could mean dying in prison, his legacy sealed forever as a man who tried to reinvent but failed. An acquittal, on the other hand, could mean freedom, a chance to finally outrun the legend. The line between those two outcomes was razor thin. The cooperating witnesses gave the most explosive testimony when they spoke of murder. They claimed Supreme had ordered hits, paid for killings, orchestrated violence that tied directly to his feud with rivals and the hip-hop world. They described how money was passed, how orders were given, how men carried out his will. Prosecutors hammered those details home, telling the jury that Kenneth wasn't just a businessman. He was the center of a machine fueled by fear and death. The defense tried to remind jurors of context. They said the witnesses were self-serving. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence linking Supreme directly to the murders. No fingerprints, no weapons, no tapes where he explicitly gave an order. They argued that the government was relying on reputation, not reality, convicting a man based on who he was believed to be, not what could be proven beyond doubt. And yet, reputation is a powerful thing. Jurors, like anyone else, felt the weight of his name. They had read headlines, heard whispers, maybe even listened to songs that spoke of him with reverence and fear. Sitting in that jury box, listening to weeks of testimony, it became harder and harder to separate myth from fact. The RICO indictment gave prosecutors the power to weave everything together: drugs, money, murders, music, film. They didn't need to prove each charge beyond shadow of a doubt. They needed to prove the enterprise existed, that Kenneth was at its head, that he had benefited from its crimes. It was a wide net, and Supreme was caught in the middle. For the community, the trial was spectacle. News outlets covered it with fascination, painting Supreme as the ultimate test case of the street-to-rap pipeline. Was he a reformed man trying to produce movies? Or was he still a kingpin hiding in plain sight? Fans debated, families worried, and the legend of Supreme grew larger with every headline. Inside that courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. Each witness brought new tension. Each piece of evidence shifted the scales. And as the case unfolded, one thing became clear. The government wasn't just trying to convict Kenneth McGriff. They were trying to erase the line between his past and his present, to prove that no matter what he built in music or film, he would always be supreme of the streets. The question was no longer whether he had truly changed. It was whether a jury could be convinced that he ever had the chance. And as the closing arguments loomed, the air in the courtroom seemed to still. Because what came next would not just decide Kenneth's future. It would decide the story that would be told about him forever. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the man whose name had been whispered in both fear and fascination for decades. Kenneth Supreme McGriff sat at the defense table, still and composed, as though carved from stone. He had been here before, in courtrooms, under the government's gaze, but this time was different. This time the charges weren't just about drugs or cash. This time, the word murder hung in the air like smoke, and the indictment itself was wrapped in one of the government's most devastating weapons, RICO. From the very start, the trial carried the atmosphere of spectacle. Reporters filed daily stories. Hip-hop fans whispered about it in barbershops. The industry, too, watched with unease. This wasn't just about one man. It was about whether the street rap pipeline, the blending of hustlers and artists, will be put on trial alongside him. And in many ways, that's exactly what prosecutors wanted. The government's narrative was sharp, almost cinematic. They told the jury that Kenneth was not a reformed man, not a businessman who had traded corners for cameras. They said he was still supreme, still orchestrating violence from behind the scenes, still laundering money through Murder Incorporated. They painted him as the quiet architect of chaos, a man who could smile in public while signing death sentences in private. Each piece of evidence, each witness, was woven into this story until it seemed inevitable. Supreme had never stopped. They brought in wiretaps, phone records where vague words took on sinister meaning when prosecutors tied them to shootings. They showed photographs of Kenneth with known associates, framing those moments as conspiratorial meetings. They displayed bank slips and film budgets, calling them smoke screens for cash from the streets. But what gave their story its heartbeat were the witnesses. One by one, men who had once moved beside Kenneth walked to the stand. Their voices trembled at times, some out of fear, some out of calculation. They told the jury about meetings in cars, envelopes of money, whispered orders that led to bullets. They pointed at Kenneth and said he was the boss, the one whose approval meant life or death. These men were not saints. They were killers, dealers, hustlers themselves. The defense hammered that point, arguing that their testimony was nothing more than lies told in exchange for lighter sentences. But prosecutors didn't need saints. They needed storytellers. And these witnesses gave them exactly that. The defense fought back with precision. They reminded the jury that there was no tape of Kenneth giving a direct order to kill. No photograph of him handing over a weapon. No fingerprints on the bullets. They said the government was stacking shadows, building a case on myth and reputation. They painted Supreme as a man who had been trapped by his past, judged forever by the legend that followed him, unable to live free even when he tried. To the defense, this wasn't justice. It was persecution dressed up in legal language. The clash was relentless. Prosecution wove its narrative of empire and violence, while the defense dismantled every piece, asking the jury to see through smoke and mirrors. Each side leaned into emotion. Prosecutors stoking fear of a kingpin who could not be stopped, the defense appealing to fairness, reminding jurors of the American promise that guilt must be proven beyond doubt. The presence of the music industry loomed heavy over it all. Murder Incorporated, once one of the hottest labels in America, was dragged into the courtroom by association. Songs were dissected, lyrics quoted, videos scrutinized. Prosecutors argued that music had become the facade for crime, that studios and sets were just new versions of street corners and stash houses. The defense pushed back, saying hip-hop was art, expression, culture, not evidence. But the lines blurred. Every time a rapper's name was mentioned, every time Murder Incorporated was tied to Kenneth, the tension deepened. Jurors sat caught in the middle, eyes darting between the man at the defense table and the witnesses who accused him. Did they see a cold-blooded killer hiding behind the veil of entertainment? Or did they see a man being buried by the weight of his reputation? The trial dragged on for weeks, each day peeling back new layers, each day drawing Kenneth's future closer to its edge. And through it all, Supreme sat with that same calm. Unreadable. To some, it was arrogance. To others, discipline. Maybe it was simply survival, the ability to remain composed even as the government tried to write the final chapter of his story. Closing arguments were a battle of visions. Prosecutors told the jury that Kenneth McGriff was the same man he had always been, the streets of Queens alive in him, no matter how far he tried to run. They said justice demanded a conviction, that society needed protection from a man who could turn music into murder. The defense pleaded for perspective. They said the government had built a story, not a case, that Kenneth was not guilty of murder for hire, simply because the legend of Supreme was too large to ignore. When the jury was finally handed the case, the silence in the courtroom was heavy. Supreme's fate rested not in the hands of prosecutors or witnesses, but in 12 strangers asked to decide whether a man was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, or guilty simply because the world already believed he was. The verdict had not yet come, but the air was electric with anticipation. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Inside, Kenneth sat still, waiting. And the cliffhanger was brutal. Would the jury see through the government's sweeping narrative? Or would they deliver the judgment that would define Supreme forever? The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces pale and unreadable. For days they had sat in silence, deliberating over wiretaps, testimony, and evidence that stretched back decades. Now, they carried the weight of a man's future in their hands. The room was hushed, the tension sharp enough to cut. Kenneth Supreme McGriff sat at the defense table, expressionless, his stillness masking the storm beneath. The foreperson stood, paper trembling slightly in their grip. And then the words came, guilty. Guilty on racketeering. Guilty on drug trafficking. Guilty on murder conspiracy. Each count landed like a hammer, reverberating through the walls. For prosecutors, it was vindication. For the defense, it was defeat. For Kenneth, it was the end of one story and the beginning of another. Life behind bars with no possibility of parole. The year was 2007. Nearly 30 years had passed since the birth of the Supreme Team in South Jamaica. 30 years since Kenneth first tasted power on the corners, since the crack epidemic turned him into a kingpin. Now, after decades of pursuit, after prison bids and attempts at reinvention, the federal government had finally succeeded in burying him under the weight of the law. RICO had done its job. The government's narrative of an enterprise fueled by drugs, violence, and intimidation had convinced the jury. They said Supreme wasn't just a man tied to crime. He was the boss of it, the architect, the figure who had orchestrated from the shadows, even when he claimed to have turned legitimate. And the murder-for-hire allegations, though built on the testimony of men with motives of their own, had been enough to tip the scales. The sentencing was brutal in its finality. Life without parole, no second chance, no hope of walking free. A death sentence delivered in paperwork, ensuring that Kenneth would die in federal custody. For a man who had once controlled empires, who had dreamed of crossing into music and film, who had brushed shoulders with stars and moguls, the reality was crushing. His life would now be measured not in records or movies, but in years counted behind razor wire and steel doors. The courtroom that day was filled with a strange mix of emotions. Some felt relief. Families of victims believed justice had finally been served, that a man tied to so much blood had been held accountable. Others felt sorrow, remembering the boy from Queens who had once been full of ambition, who might have chosen a different path. And still others, especially in hip-hop circles, saw it as another example of the government targeting black men tied to rap, punishing not just Kenneth but the culture itself. For Kenneth, there was no visible reaction. He didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't crumble. He listened, steady, as though absorbing the words into the armor he had carried for decades. But behind the calm was a reality impossible to ignore. He would never walk the streets again. The impact of the conviction rippled outward. Murder Incorporated never recovered from the heat. The music industry stepped back from its once proud connections to Supreme. Rappers who had name-dropped him in verses now grew quiet, careful not to tie themselves to a man the government had painted as a monster. The street rap nexus he had come to symbolize was scarred, reshaped by the verdict. It was no longer a glamorous blur of hustlers and artists. It was a cautionary tale of how quickly the game could swallow you whole. In Queens, the news hit differently. For some, it was the closing of a chapter that had haunted the community for too long, an end to decades of violence and addiction tied to his name. For others, it was bittersweet. Kenneth had been feared, yes, but also respected, admired, even loved by those who remembered his generosity, his attempts to play Robin Hood in a world that offered little hope. His conviction was both justice and tragedy, proof of choices made and proof of the system's unforgiving hand. Life in federal prison meant a world stripped bare. No glitz, no cameras, no cars, no music studios. Just time, endless time. Supreme entered the system as a legend, but legends carry little weight behind steel doors. There he was another inmate, another number, another man whose empire had crumbled outside. For someone who had lived with discipline and order, perhaps prison became routine. But routine can also be torment. Each day a mirror of the last. Each year another reminder of what could have been. The story of Kenneth McGriff's conviction is more than one man's downfall. It's a mirror of America's streets in the 80s, of the crack epidemic that built empires and destroyed families, of the way ambition can twist into destruction. It's also a story of reinvention attempted and denied, of a man who reached for legitimacy in music and film, but was pulled back into the shadows by both his past and the government's relentless pursuit. The trial and sentencing carved his name into history, not as just a hustler, not just as a man tied to hip-hop, but as a symbol of the blurred line between crime and culture. To some, he was a cautionary tale. To others, a martyr of sorts, punished more for his legend than his deeds. But to the government, he was finally caged, finally silenced. And yet, even in conviction, the questions lingered. How much of the case was fact? And how much was built on perception? How much was proven? And how much was assumed because of who Kenneth Supreme McGriff had been? Did the government truly dismantle a criminal enterprise? Or did they trap a man in the weight of his own myth? As the gavel fell, as the sentence was read, one truth stood above all others. The story of Supreme was not ending in freedom or redemption. It was ending in life behind bars, a legend sealed inside concrete and steel. But legends rarely stay quiet. And even as Kenneth began his new life in prison, his name continued to echo in songs, in stories, in whispers across Queens. A man may be caged, but myths travel freely. And so the chapter closes with a paradox. Supreme had been defeated, sentenced to die in prison. But in the world outside, his story lived on, carried in verses, in debates, in memories that refused to fade. The question left behind was haunting. Had justice truly been served? Or had the legend of Supreme grown so powerful that conviction was inevitable, no matter the evidence? The jury had given their answer. The government had claimed its victory. But the streets, the same streets that made him, the same streets that cursed him, would keep asking forever. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, the sound echoing through concrete hallways like a final verdict. Kenneth Supreme McGriff has been living with that sound since 2007, when a federal judge sentenced him to life without parole. It is a rhythm he can't escape, a reminder that his empire, once built on discipline, fear, and respect, has been replaced by routine and walls. The man who once commanded entire neighborhoods now wakes to head counts, metal bars, and the endless sameness of prison life. Yet even in confinement, his name refuses to fade. Behind bars, Kenneth is no longer the kingpin on the corner or the producer funding music videos. But his story, his legend, continues to ripple outward. In the eyes of the law, he is just another inmate, a number in the system. To the streets of Queens, and to hip-hop, he remains something larger, an icon, a cautionary tale, a ghost whose influence refuses to die. Prison is designed to strip a man of power. Your schedule is not your own. Meals are portioned, movements are monitored, conversations are overheard. But some men carry power with them, even into the most controlled spaces. Supreme is one of them. Other inmates know his name, know the stories that brought him here. In a place where respect can mean survival, his past carries weight. Stories of the Supreme team, of his discipline, of his calm, still give him a presence even when the outside world has changed. But power in prison is different than power in the streets. It's smaller, quieter, filtered through routine. Kenneth cannot run empires anymore. He cannot bankroll records, films, or corner crews. What he can do is remain steady. In letters, in calls, in the rare words that leave those walls, he tries to hold onto dignity. His legend makes it out, carried by those who still speak his name, by rappers who still reference him, by journalists who still write about his rise and fall. And that is the strange truth of Supreme's life behind bars. He is physically gone, yet symbolically present. In the streets of South Jamaica, old heads still remember the days of the Supreme team. Some recall the fear, the corners drenched in crack, the violence, the intimidation. Others remember a different side, the discipline he enforced, the order he maintained, even the moments where he played Robin Hood to a community that felt abandoned. In memory, he is both monster and protector, villain and folk hero. The duality of his legacy is impossible to escape. In hip-hop, his influence is etched even deeper. Rappers still speak his name, using it as shorthand for authenticity, for the kind of street credibility that can't be faked. To be compared to Supreme is to be recognized as real, as someone who lived what others only rap about. But his story is also a warning, a reminder of how quickly power can turn a prison, how the same legend that builds respect can also build a cage. Lyrics referencing Supreme carry both admiration and caution, celebration and tragedy. For Kenneth himself, life behind bars must be a cruel mirror. He once dreamed of reinvention, of leaving the corner for the camera, of producing films and music that would tell stories instead of living them. He touched that dream briefly, funding movies, standing beside stars, building connections that could have carried him into a new chapter. But prison slammed the door shut. Now, the only stories he can tell are those told about him, not by him. The weight of time is heavy in prison. Days blur into weeks, weeks into years. For Supreme, each year marks not just survival, but distance. Distance from the streets he once ruled. Distance from the music industry that once embraced him. Distance from freedom itself. The world outside moves forward. Hip-hop evolves. Queens changes. New names rise and fall. But inside, he is frozen, locked into a sentence that stretches beyond imagination. And yet, the paradox remains. Even as time pulls him further from relevance, his name does not vanish. The legend of Supreme has become part of the DNA of hip-hop, part of the history of New York, part of the story of America's war on drugs and the communities it shaped. To study the streets of the 80s is to study the Supreme team. To study the intersection of crime and culture is to study Kenneth McGriff. His life behind bars is not just his own. It is a chapter in a larger story still being written. The way he is remembered depends on who is telling the story. To law enforcement, he is the cautionary example of a criminal enterprise dismantled by the government's patience and power. To some in his community, he is the boy from Queens who became a symbol of both ambition and destruction, a man who gave and took in equal measure. To hip-hop, he is a bridge between the hustle and the art, between the streets and the studio, between myth and reality. The truth, as always, is complicated. Supreme was not only one thing. He was not only a villain, nor only a visionary. He was a man shaped by his time, by the crack epidemic, by poverty and ambition, by choices and consequences. Life behind bars has locked him away, but it cannot erase the layers of his story. His legend lives in songs, in conversations, in memories whispered late at night when the past feels close. And maybe that is the cruelest irony of all. Prison can take freedom, but it cannot take legacy. Kenneth McGriff is proof of that. Even as he wakes to counts and closes his eyes to steal, his story is alive outside, reshaped and retold, remembered and debated. He is gone, but not gone. Silenced, but still speaking through the echoes of what he built, what he lost, and what he became. The question is what happens next. Will his story remain one of crime and punishment, of ambition turned to downfall? Or will future generations remember him differently, as a man who tried to reinvent, who reached for legitimacy, but was crushed by the weight of his past and the government's relentless pursuit? For now, Kenneth sits in federal prison, life without parole stretching endlessly ahead. The world outside will continue to change. Hip-hop will move forward. New legends will rise. But the name Supreme will linger, caught forever between admiration and condemnation, a reminder of how thin the line can be between power and ruin. And somewhere, in the silence of his cell, perhaps Kenneth wonders which version of him will be remembered. The boy from Queens, the kingpin, the would-be producer, or the ghost of a legend locked away, still haunting the culture that once embraced him? The story of Kenneth McGriff does not end with a verdict or the slam of a gavel. It lingers. It echoes. It walks a thin line between glory and devastation, between myth and truth. Even today, his name lives in two worlds at once. Condemned as a ruthless kingpin who poisoned his own community, and celebrated as a cultural figure who bridged the streets and rap, forever etched into the DNA of New York City. That is the paradox of Supreme. One man, two legacies, inseparable, yet forever at war with each other. To understand the weight of his legacy, you have to return to where it began. South Jamaica, Queens. The streets he once ruled still carry his ghost. For the older generation, his name conjures up memories of the crack years, of children lost, of corners soaked in addiction and violence. They remember the fear that followed him, the way his organization operated like a machine, strict and merciless. To them, his legacy is one of destruction. He did not just sell drugs. He dismantled families. He hollowed out futures. His empire was built on broken lives, and no amount of glamour can erase that truth. And yet, for another generation, his name carries a different meaning. They remember the discipline he enforced, the order he demanded, the way he commanded respect. They remember stories of him handing out money, taking care of people, playing Robin Hood in a city that often forgot its poor. They see him as more than just a dealer. They see him as a symbol of ambition, of control, of someone who rose from the bottom and created something massive, even if it was built on crime. In their eyes, he's not just a villain. He is a complicated figure, as much admired as feared. Then there is hip-hop, the culture that absorbed him and, in turn, amplified his myth. Supreme became more than a name. He became a reference point, a stamp of authenticity. Rappers invoked him to signal that they were real, that they had ties to the streets, that their words were not fiction but fact. His presence in the world of Murder Incorporated, his connections to music videos, films, and artists, blurred the line between hustler and mogul. And in doing so, he helped create a template, the idea that the stories of the streets could be translated into art, into culture, into business. But hip-hop also immortalized his downfall. Songs that referenced him often carried a shadow, a reminder that the life he lived had consequences. He became both warning and inspiration, a man who showed what power looked like and what ruin felt like. That duality has kept his name alive long after his empire crumbled and his prison sentence began. The government tells its own version of his legacy. To prosecutors, Kenneth McGriff is proof of the system's strength, a man who once seemed untouchable but was eventually brought down. His story is used as an example, a case study of how even the most disciplined, the most powerful, cannot outrun the law forever. To them, his name stands for crime dismantled, justice served, a victory in the long, messy war on drugs and organized crime. But on the streets and in culture, legacies are not written by prosecutors. They are written by memory, by stories whispered and retold, by lyrics that slip his name into rhyme. And that is why his story is not simple. He is both cautionary tale and legend. He is both condemned and celebrated. He is both destroyer and builder. There is tragedy in that duality. Supreme could have been something else. His discipline, his intelligence, his ability to organize. These were qualities that might have built a legitimate empire had the circumstances been different. When he tried to pivot in entertainment, into movies and music, he showed a glimpse of what that might have looked like. But by then, the weight of his past was too heavy. The government was waiting, and his legend had already outgrown his reality. In the end, he could not escape the world that had made him. And so, his legacy becomes a mirror. When people talk about Supreme, they reveal as much about themselves as about him. Some see the monster who bled a community dry. Others see the hustler who demanded respect in a world that gave him nothing. Some see the bridge between the streets and rap, the man who brought authenticity to an industry built on storytelling. Others see the failure, the man who reached for legitimacy and was pulled back down into the shadows. What cannot be denied is his place in history. Kenneth Supreme, McGriff is woven into the story of New York City crime, into the evolution of hip-hop, into the narrative of the crack era and its aftermath. His name is carved alongside the empires he built and the lives he destroyed. It is etched into lyrics, into documentaries, into debates that will outlive him. He is not forgotten, and he will not be. But what remains is the question that hovers over his story like smoke. Which legacy will dominate? Will he be remembered as the ruthless kingpin who left scars on Queens, or as the cultural figure who bridged hustling and rap, turning his life into a symbol larger than himself? The answer, perhaps, is both. Kenneth McGriff's legacy is not one thing. It is everything at once. It is the destruction he caused and the respect he commanded. It is the art he influenced and the prison cell that holds him now. It is the story of America's streets and the culture that grew from them. And so, his name endures, forever split between fear and admiration, between the courtroom and the recording booth, between the shadows of South Jamaica and the spotlight of hip-hop. Kenneth Supreme McGriff will die in prison, but his story will live far beyond those walls, carried in whispers, in rhymes, in the complicated memory of a city that both loved and hated him. The door closes on his chapter, but the echo lingers. Because in the end, the legacy of Supreme is not just about him. It is about us, about what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget, and how we reconcile the brutal truth that sometimes legends are both heroes and villains at the same time. And somewhere, in the space between myth and reality, the shadow of Supreme remains.